It begins with an object that should not exist, an artifact so quietly defiant that its very presence feels like a breach in the timeline. Long before batteries, optics, or precision engineering were supposed to emerge, the ancient cities of Mesopotamia guarded items that whisper a different history. The Baghdad Battery, a modest clay jar sealed with asphalt and crowned by a corroded iron rod, sits in museums as if it were harmless. Yet even in its silence, it radiates a question no textbook comfortably answers. Nearby, the Nimrud crystal lens, polished to a curvature modern opticians recognize instantly, stares back with an elegance that implies intentional design. And scattered across vaults and archives are diorite vessels drilled with such perfect concentric precision that engineers shake their heads, uncertain how hands armed only with copper tools supposedly achieved the feat. Together, these artifacts form a triad of impossibility, a quiet rebellion against the linear story we tell about human progress. For generations, we've been taught that science unfolds as a slow, deliberate climb, each century ascending from ignorance toward enlightenment. Yet here lie objects demanding electricity, optics, geometry, and mechanical stability thousands of years before such knowledge officially entered the human record. They do not belong to their time. They do not conform to our expectations, and they refuse to be dismissed, no matter how many placards label them as ceremonial, decorative, or simply misunderstood. Their existence forces a question too large to ignore. Why do we keep finding artifacts that require scientific understanding long before science supposedly existed? It is a question that archaeologists, engineers, and historians continue to approach with caution, even as the evidence grows more difficult to wave away. Each artifact becomes another thread tugging at the edges of the official timeline, suggesting it may be thinner than we imagined. Picture these objects not as isolated anomalies, but as fragments of a larger mosaic. Mesopotamia was a cradle of writing, law, agriculture, and the earliest known cities, yet beneath its sands lie technologies that feel startlingly advanced. A battery that produces voltage, a lens capable of magnification, a vessel drilled with mechanical consistency. They transform from curiosities into provocations, hinting at forgotten chapters or unrecorded exchanges of knowledge. And as the camera draws closer to each artifact, as light glances across their surfaces, a deeper tension emerges. These items do not merely challenge archaeological assumptions, they challenge our assumptions about ourselves and the civilizations that preceded us. They invite us to look again, to reconsider what it means for something to be impossible. If you've ever felt that history has gaps, that some ancient achievements seem too abrupt or too sophisticated to appear without precedent, then you will recognize the sensation these objects evoke. They are small, simple, almost unremarkable at first glance, yet within their frames lies a puzzle that refuses easy solutions. Why did ancient artisans craft a lens with a focal length near modern standards? Why did someone construct a jar that becomes a power source as soon as acidic liquid enters it? How did they drill stone so hard modern recreations struggle to match the speed and smoothness of the original marks? These questions echo across time, resonating through museum halls and archaeological reports, tapping insistently at the boundaries of what we think we know. Some viewers may already feel the pull of that mystery. If so, this is the moment to stay engaged, because the deeper we go, the more the puzzle expands. Consider subscribing as we unravel the layers of one of humanity's oldest enigmas. The story becomes more intricate with every artifact we unveil. The heart of this investigation lies not in claiming certainty, but in allowing curiosity to lead the way. These objects deserve more than a passing glance. They deserve to be understood within the context of the civilizations that birthed them, civilizations that may have inherited knowledge from sources long forgotten or catastrophically erased. The sands of Mesopotamia have preserved empires, libraries, temples, and trade routes, but they have also preserved secrets. Each time a trowel strikes earth in the ruins of Ur, Uruk, Nineveh, or Nimrud, The expectations of archaeology confront the unpredictable truth of what the past chooses to reveal. In the decades ahead, more of these impossible artifacts will undoubtedly surface, challenging scholars and captivating the public. But today, the story begins with the quiet weight of what we already have, with objects that speak despite lacking inscriptions, with technologies disguised as simple tools. These three artifacts, introduced in the opening minutes, serve as the gateway into a deeper, stranger narrative. They open a crack in the historical timeline wide enough to peer through, inviting us to imagine what might lie beyond. Were these early experiments, brilliant anomalies, or remnants of knowledge older than recorded civilization? The question lingers as the music fades and the dust settles around the frame. We stand at the threshold of a journey that will carry us from dig sites to museum basements, from ancient tablets to modern laboratories, unraveling a story that challenges the boundaries of accepted history. And so Block 1 closes where the mystery truly begins, with the recognition that these artifacts should not exist, yet undeniably do. That contradiction becomes our compass as we continue. For if the first objects we encounter already defy the official narrative, what deeper revelations await in the layers beneath? The contradictions introduced by those impossible artifacts linger like dust suspended in late afternoon light as the narrative moves deeper into the archaeologists' first encounters with the ancient cities of Sumer. When 19th and early 20th century expeditions set out across the plains of southern Iraq, their expectations were shaped by a simple assumption: the farther back one digs, the more primitive the world should become. They imagined villages of mud brick, rudimentary tools, scattered pottery. They prepared themselves for the infancy of human organization, a time before formal cities or structured knowledge. But the earth had preserved a different truth. With every layer removed, every tablet exposed, the expectations began to fracture. Something about these ruins felt too complete, too deliberate, as if civilization had sprung forward in an abrupt leap rather than a gradual climb. And for those who witnessed it firsthand, the discovery created an uneasy tension between what they had been taught and what they were seeing. At Ur, the city of the moon god, excavators uncovered sprawling residential quarters, standardized brick measurements, drainage systems, and temples built with architectural precision. At Uruk, the earliest known writing emerged not as clumsy attempts, but as an already functional system of record-keeping, capable of tracking trade, labor, and offerings with remarkable efficiency. In Nineveh and Nimrud, palace libraries surfaced filled with astronomical observations, medical prescriptions, and mathematical calculations that hinted at a sophisticated grasp of celestial cycles. It was as though Sumer had stepped onto the stage of history fully dressed, carrying tools, symbols, and structures that should have taken millennia to refine. Archaeologists documented it, photographed it, cataloged it, yet many struggled to reconcile the evidence with the belief that civilization grows slowly, layer by predictable layer. The surprise deepened as specialists examined the administrative tablets. Instead of primitive scratches, they found ratios, inventories, star tables, and geometrically precise markings. Some tablets displayed base 60 mathematics, a system elegant enough to survive into modern measurement. Others referenced standardized fields, irrigation control, and long-distance trade networks. This was not the work of a society fumbling its way into complexity. It was the work of a culture already fluent in organization, already comfortable with abstraction, already capable of designing cities with intent rather than chance. Even the earliest strata seemed to reject the notion of a developmental ramp. And as each new gallery of artifacts reached Western museums, scholars attempted to frame the evidence within the existing timeline, though the timeline resisted, buckling beneath the sophistication it was asked to contain. The field journals from those early excavations convey a mixture of excitement and disbelief. Though written in the measured tone of scientific reporting, many entries reveal quiet astonishment. One archaeologist noted that the first true urban centers appeared with a suddenness that defies expectation, Another wrote that Sumerian accounting systems showed a maturity inconsistent with their antiquity. Even the architecture posed unsettling questions. How did the earliest cities already understand load distribution, ziggurat stabilization, and standardized construction? How did they develop workshops capable of producing metal goods with surprising uniformity? These questions were rarely asked aloud, yet they lingered beneath the surface of each publication, a silent acknowledgement that something about Sumer did not align with the traditional model of human progress. As the camera moves through reconstructed rooms in museums and across the aerial views of ancient foundations, the narrative sharpens the contrast between expectation and reality. One might imagine early civilization as a gradual aggregation of scattered tribes, each contributing to a slow rise in complexity. Instead, the dig sites tell a story of abrupt organization, streets plotted on grids, craft guilds specializing in metallurgy, weaving, and ceramics, temples functioning as administrative hubs rather than merely spiritual centers. Even the earliest layers show coordinated labor and resource management, implying knowledge systems already in place before the first bricks were laid. This is the paradox that shaped the earliest debates. If civilization began here, why does it appear so refined at the moment of its birth? It is here, in the tension between prediction and discovery, that the impossible artifacts introduced earlier begin to cast longer shadows. If the foundations of Sumerian society already show signs of maturity, then the presence of anomalous tools and technologies no longer feels like isolated accidents. They feel like clues to a deeper inheritance. Were the Sumerians innovators, or were they heirs to traditions carried through a forgotten age? The archaeologists of the early 20th century could not openly propose such ideas, yet the evidence they uncovered continues to provoke questions modern viewers are now more willing to entertain. And if you are still with this journey, take a moment to stay connected. These early contradictions build toward revelations that reshape the entire narrative. As we move forward, we step into the unsettling realization that Sumer's beginnings are not beginnings at all, but continuations of something older. The cities rise from the earth already complete, as though guided by memory rather than invention. The inscriptions speak in a language without known relatives, as if carried from a world that ended before recorded time. And the artifacts, some simple, some impossibly advanced, wait patiently for those willing to look past assumptions. The contradictions that startled the first archaeologists now become the foundation of our inquiry, leading us to the next layer of the story. And so this block ends where the tension sharpens. If the earliest civilizations appear fully formed, what else might be hiding in the details they left behind? The revelations from those first excavations echo as we turn toward the wider world that once surrounded the Sumerians, a landscape shaped by rivers, trade winds, and the steady rhythm of early human ambition. The floodplains between the Tigris and Euphrates were never peaceful boundaries. They were living arteries that carried silt, stories, and strangers from distant horizons. When early explorers described Mesopotamia as a cradle of civilization, they were referring to more than its cities. They were acknowledging the environment that allowed those cities to emerge with such startling completeness. Here, the flat expanse stretched outward in every direction, offering no natural barriers, no mountains to halt migration, no valleys to isolate cultures. It was a crossroads long before writing appeared, a place where ideas could gather and accelerate. Yet even this fertile setting cannot fully explain the sudden sophistication revealed in the ruins. The land provided opportunity, not inevitability, and the scale of Sumer's early achievements suggests that something more than environment shaped its origins. Imagine the world as it existed when the first temple complexes rose above the plains. To the north, highlands offered timber and stone. To the east, mountains concealed metals that would one day become tools, blades, and ornaments. To the south, the Persian Gulf opened pathways toward distant cultures whose traces are faint but undeniable. This region formed an intricate network long before anyone carved the first cuneiform signs. Traders, shepherds, artisans, and wanderers crossed its reaches, leaving impressions that would later blend into Sumer's sudden urban bloom. But even with this natural interconnectedness, scholars struggle to explain how the earliest cities appear with administrative orders already established, with standardized brick molds, with scribes capable of producing accounts, star charts, and inventories that seem far too advanced for a civilization supposedly in its infancy. The continuity of landscape does not account for the discontinuity of achievement. As the narrative deepens, we begin to reconstruct the world as the Sumerians might have perceived it. Their myths speak of gods arriving from distant realms, of knowledge bestowed rather than discovered, of foundations laid according to heavenly patterns. Though mythology cannot be taken as literal history, it reveals how the early Mesopotamians understood their relationship to knowledge. They believed themselves inheritors, not originators. Their stories reflect a world where cities, laws, and technologies were restorations of memories left behind by earlier ages. While such ideas cannot be confirmed directly, the archaeological record offers intriguing parallels. The sudden emergence of writing, the advanced mathematics, the carefully planned cities, all hint at a lineage of understanding that predates the first visible settlements. And this idea grows heavier when we consider the anomalous artifacts introduced earlier, objects that feel like echoes from a forgotten era embedded within a flourishing civilization. The world of ancient Mesopotamia was layered with meaning, from the ziggurats aligned to cardinal points to the fields organized with geometric precision. The Sumerians seemed to possess an awareness of the skies far greater than what their simple tools should have allowed. Their early star lists map constellations with clarity, and their calendars track lunar and solar movements with sophistication. This degree of astronomical insight implies sustained observation, perhaps over thousands of years, or perhaps through access to older records now lost. Yet when archaeologists first uncovered these tablets, they treated them as curiosities rather than contradictions. Only later did researchers begin to see the pattern. The earliest examples are too complete, the learning curve too steep. If the world of Sumer is a tapestry, it is woven not from the improvisation of a newborn society, but from the remnants of something endured and remembered. Even the geographical placement of the ancient cities invites reflection. Uruk, Eridu, and Lagash form a constellation of settlements whose foundations often overlay earlier, mysterious layers. Some cities appear to have been rebuilt multiple times across vast spans, each iteration rising after catastrophic interruptions. This cyclic pattern, construction, destruction, renewal, suggests periods of loss, followed by attempts to recover or preserve inherited knowledge. Geological surveys reveal shifts in river courses, regional droughts, and floods that periodically transformed the land, pushing populations to adapt or migrate. Yet the resilience and consistency of Sumerian cultural systems imply that their essential intellectual framework survived these upheavals intact. Such stability raises the question of whether their concepts of measurement, engineering, and organization were not innovations of the moment, but fragments of an older blueprint. One can imagine how easy it would be for such a blueprint to degrade over generations, leaving behind only hints in artifacts that now appear out of place. Walking through reconstructed Mesopotamian streets in museum exhibits, one notices the familiarity of certain designs. Gridded city blocks, courtyards with drainage channels, administrative chambers with designated areas for counting goods, structures that feel more modern than ancient. The deeper one studies them, the more they resemble the culmination of trial-tested systems rather than the first attempts. And surrounding these architectural achievements are tools, seals, votive objects, and fragments of technology whose purposes remain elusive. Among them, the crystal lenses, copper cylinders, and precision-drilled vessels take on new significance. They may not be isolated accidents, but part of a cultural memory extending far beyond the visible record. In this widening world, these artifacts become not mysteries but markers, guiding us toward the next phase of the investigation. As this block draws to its close, we hold the image of a civilization emerging in a landscape already humming with movement, exchange, and unspoken inheritance. The world around Sumer supported growth, yet the nature of that growth defies simple explanation. The artifacts, the architecture, the mathematics, the inscriptions, they all point to an ancestry of knowledge older than the cities that preserved it. And as we step forward, we prepare to examine the objects that carry this hidden lineage most clearly. Those quiet fragments sitting behind museum glass with labels that reveal nothing of their true mystery. The stage is set for the discovery of the out-of-place artifacts that deepen the contradiction and draw us further into the enigma of Mesopotamia's impossible past. The world we have rebuilt so far, its cities, rivers, and inherited echoes, now sharpens into a more intimate focus as we approach the small artifacts that museums often display without commentary, as if their very existence were not a quiet challenge to the historical framework surrounding them. In shadowed cases along quiet gallery walls lie objects crafted with a precision difficult to reconcile with their age. They are not monumental like ziggurats, nor inscribed with myths like temple tablets. They are modest, almost forgettable. Yet it is these humble pieces that press most insistently against the accepted storyline. Their understated presence makes the contradiction sharper, for they do not announce themselves as marvels. They reveal their importance only when examined closely, almost reluctantly, as though the past hoped to keep their meaning hidden. Consider the polished crystal lenses. Small, oval, deceptively simple. At first glance, they resemble decorative inlays or ritual tokens. Only under careful study does their curvature appear deliberate, shaped by someone who understood how light bends through transparent stone. Their surfaces show patterns consistent with intentional grinding, not random abrasion. And when tested, they magnify precisely. This is not merely artistry, it is applied design. Yet museum tags often dismiss them with the vague phrase, unknown purpose, a label that avoids admitting the deeper issue. For if these lenses were truly used to see the world more clearly, then the people who made them possessed knowledge that should not have existed in that era. The contradiction sits silently behind the glass, waiting for anyone brave enough to look for too long. Nearby, clay jars with copper cylinders and iron rods rest in simple displays, their corroded surfaces offering no immediate hint of significance. These artifacts resemble household items, yet their internal arrangement replicates the essential geometry of a galvanic cell. Though not as elaborate as the Baghdad Battery itself, these earlier or variant forms suggest experimentation, refinement, or perhaps preservation of a technique inherited from long-lost workshops. The fact that multiple museums hold similar pieces, many similarly labeled as vessels of uncertain use, raises an uncomfortable thought. If these objects were isolated, we might dismiss them, but they appear repeatedly across sites and centuries, quiet signatures of a forgotten tradition. Their existence is not rare, it is recurring, and recurrence demands explanation. Then there are the stone vessels, diorite bowls drilled with smooth concentric walls that reveal tool marks spiraling with mechanical continuity. These markings challenge the limits of copper-based tools, which should struggle against materials so dense and unforgiving. Yet the vessels exist, intact, elegant, and perfectly balanced. When engineers analyze the symmetry and uniformity of these objects, they often conclude that the required rotational control is more consistent with a stable drilling apparatus than with hand tools. But such devices do not appear in the archaeological record, nor do the copper implements found at the sites display wear patterns matching the observed precision. The vessels thus remain unsolved puzzles, presenting evidence of a technique without an identified tool, a craft without a known craftsman. One might imagine these items as isolated anomalies, but their distribution erodes that comfort. They appear in multiple cities, across different periods, suggesting a broader cultural awareness. Their subtlety is their strength. They do not advertise technology, yet they embody it. Each artifact feels like a whisper from an earlier age, preserved by artisans who may not have fully understood the origins of their own inherited practices. Such a possibility aligns uncomfortably well with the abrupt sophistication found in Sumerian city planning and record-keeping. Perhaps what we see in these objects is not innovation but retention, fragments of a deeper memory carried forward through cycles of collapse and rebirth. As the camera glides slowly across these cases, the atmosphere thickens with the tension between what these artifacts reveal and what official narratives allow. Museums, bound to caution, often sidestep their implications. Scholars classify them conservatively, yet the objects remain, stubborn in their material reality. They refuse to conform to assumptions about primitive beginnings. They instead nudge the narrative toward a possibility few dare articulate directly, that these tools, jars, and lenses may be remnants of a knowledge system partially erased, surviving only in disrupted pieces. Such a thought hovers at the edge of the documentary now, inviting the viewer to question which is more implausible, that ancient artisans achieved these feats through unknown ingenuity, or that they repeated something passed down from an age older than memory. This block closes as the tension between expectation and evidence deepens. If simple artifacts already strain the limits of conventional explanation, then the more complex technologies ahead will press even harder. And with that, we turn toward one of the most provocative objects ever uncovered in Mesopotamia, an item whose controversy, simplicity, and demonstrable functionality make it impossible to ignore. The stage is set for the moment when the story shifts from unusual objects to undeniable capability, challenging the boundary between curiosity and revelation. The contradictions that emerged from those quiet artifacts now lead us into the realm that the ancient Sumerians themselves used to explain the world, their mythology, their cosmology, the great narrative architecture through which they understood origins and order. For in their oldest tablets, long predating the royal chronicles and economic records, the Sumerians spoke of a structured universe governed not by chance, but by forces that shaped civilization long before mortals began to build cities. These stories were not merely myths. They formed the intellectual framework of a people who believed knowledge came from elsewhere, bestowed rather than discovered. And as we read them today, with the impossible artifacts in mind, they take on an unexpected resonance, revealing how the earliest Mesopotamians perceived themselves not as pioneers of innovation, but as custodians of something older. In their cosmology, the heavens emerged first, spreading into layered realms where divine beings governed domains of water, air, earth, and the deep. The gods were not abstract symbols, they were architects. They assigned structure to chaos, established laws for movement, and bestowed the fundamental patterns by which life could flourish. The Sumerians saw themselves as inheritors of these divine decrees. The Me, mysterious tablets or codes of civilization that governed everything from kingship to metallurgy, from weaving to truth itself. These Me were not inventions, they were restorations. The language used on the tablets is striking in its specificity. The gods returned the arts, restored the proper ways, re-established knowledge that had once vanished from the world. This choice of words suggests a memory of rupture, a belief that civilization had risen before and fallen, leaving only fragments to recover. It is within this worldview that the impossible artifacts find their subtle mirror. If the people of Sumer believed they were reviving lost knowledge, then the presence of advanced lenses, precision drilling, or proto-electrical devices becomes less enigmatic. These items might not represent sudden leaps, but inherited practices carried forward from an era the Sumerians mythologized as divine. The ME, though symbolic, reflect a mindset that saw civilization not as a new creation, but as a rebirth. The myths describe gods traveling between realms, granting order and reawakening forgotten technologies. Whether literal or allegorical, these narratives echo the archaeological record's abrupt sophistication. They frame knowledge as cyclical, not linear, resurfacing after ages of darkness through chosen intermediaries who remembered what the world had once been. Among the most compelling aspects of the Sumerian mythic system is its attention to astronomy. Their heavens were not a distant mystery, but a precise map, filled with markers and cycles believed to influence earthly events. The earliest star lists display a level of classification, hinting at long-term observation. Their calendar aligned celestial patterns with agricultural and ceremonial rhythms. This interplay between heavens and earth, myth and mathematics, suggests a worldview in which cosmic order and human knowledge were intertwined. Modern scholars marvel at the Sumerians' early aptitude for tracking planetary movements and predicting celestial events. In the context of their myths, this aptitude is not the outcome of incremental learning, but a remembrance of an older cosmic order taught to humanity after a devastation so profound it erased earlier epochs. The gods themselves function as personifications of forces and knowledge systems. Enki governs wisdom, craft, and the subterranean waters that bring fertility. Enlil presides over the winds, storms, and the authority of kingship. Inanna embodies power, transformation, and the duality of creation and destruction. These beings do not merely act, they instruct. They deliver the foundations of measurement, architecture, law, and ritual. In a symbolic sense, they represent knowledge systems descending into a recovering world, shaping civilizations emerging from a blank slate. If one reads the myths without prejudice, they almost describe a transmission of memory after a global rupture, a cultural inheritance rather than a cultural invention. And yet, the myths do more than explain origins. They map identity. The Sumerians saw themselves as the stewards of divine order, responsible for maintaining the balance between cosmos and civilization. Each temple, each canal, each administrative tablet carried an echo of that responsibility. In this worldview, knowledge is not merely practical, it is sacred. It must be preserved, recited, and embedded into the very structure of society. This cultural reverence for inherited wisdom may explain how certain techniques, now mysterious to us, persisted long enough to leave traces in the archaeological record. The impossible artifacts may be relics of practices whose original purpose was forgotten even by the artisans who continued them out of tradition. As this block closes, the myths stand not as fanciful tales, but as interpretive keys to the contradictions we face. They reveal how the Sumerians understood themselves and offer a lens through which the abrupt sophistication of their civilization becomes less jarring. If they truly believed they were restoring what had once been lost, then it is worth asking what fragments of that earlier knowledge might still lie beneath the sand, waiting to challenge our assumptions once again. The mythic architecture of Sumer now dissolves into the tangible rise of its earliest cities, where the abstract notions of divine order transformed into bricks, canals, workshops, and the first great administrative machines of human history. As we step into this chapter, the world shifts from celestial narratives to the physical infrastructure that made Mesopotamia unlike any place before it. Civilization did not creep into existence here. It arrived with momentum. The earliest levels of Uruk reveal a metropolis already pulsing with economic organization, specialized labor, and monumental construction. To walk through its reconstructed avenues is to glimpse a society operating with a clarity of purpose that seems to defy the technological baseline assigned to its era. It is as though someone handed the Sumerians a blueprint, comprehensive, structured, and far older than the cities that adopted it. Across the plains, administrative centers flourished with a precision that seems almost bureaucratic by modern standards. Tablets from the earliest layers record grain distributions, land allotments, temple inventories, and workforce assignments. What astonished later scholars was not merely the presence of writing, but the immediate complexity of these texts. They reveal standardized systems of accounting, formalized units of measurement, and intricate relationships between institutions. This is not the dawn of literacy, but its early maturity. Even the warehouses themselves were arranged according to predictable patterns, with partitioned chambers, numbered storage rooms, and seal-locking mechanisms designed to track the flow of goods. The sophistication of this system suggests long practice, not recent invention, challenging the idea that such organization emerged through slow trial and error. Urban planning appears equally deliberate. Streets were oriented with consistency, often aligned to cardinal directions or natural watercourses. Residential blocks clustered around communal courtyards, while temples dominated elevated platforms that anchored civic identity. That these cities arose in an environment prone to flooding and river shifts makes their durability even more remarkable. They required foresight, hydraulic management, coordinated labor, and knowledge of seasonal cycles. Archaeologists found evidence of controlled irrigation networks, with canals engineered at gradients so precise they rival the calculations used in far later civilizations. It is difficult to imagine such accuracy emerging spontaneously from scattered village life. Instead, it feels like an inherited system refined by those who already understood its underlying principles. Within those urban landscapes, craft workshops reveal another layer of unexpected complexity. Metallurgists alloyed copper with arsenic and tin, producing tools and ornaments of impressive quality. Potters mastered high-temperature kilns, achieving uniformity that suggests standardization and quality control. Textile workers produced intricate weaves using patterns that appear in later cultures across vast distances, as though traces of a shared knowledge network persisted long after its origins faded. Even early medical tablets found in the ruins of temple libraries include structured procedures and diagnostic frameworks. This level of specialization raises a question that echoes through every excavation report. How did so many advanced industries appear so early and so simultaneously? The administrative apparatus that bound these systems together grew with equal determination. Scribes trained for years to master cuneiform, learning not just symbols but the conceptual scaffolding behind them. Mathematics, trade protocols, cosmological references. Their work transformed temples into managerial hubs, coordinating labor, storage, construction, and ritual obligations. It is no coincidence that the earliest known schools appear in Sumer. Education was the engine that preserved and transmitted this inherited structure. The speed at which these institutions developed implies a foundation deeper than the archaeological layers suggest. Something had prepared this society to organize itself so completely the moment the opportunity arose. And beneath all this achievement lies a subtle, persistent tension. The rise of Sumer feels less like the invention of civilization and more like its reinstatement. Each canal, workshop, terrace, and clay tablet contributes to an impression of continuity from an unseen past. Even the earliest kings list their authority as descending from a pre-existing order, as if acknowledging that they ruled not as originators, but as successors. This perception aligns with the contradictions presented by the impossible artifacts, that the earliest civilizations may have been guided by remnants of an older system, one carried forward through myth, practice, and memory. As this block draws to its close, the image of Sumer becomes clearer yet more enigmatic. Their cities show mastery beyond what archaeology expects from humanity's first urban experiment. Their organization feels intentional, inherited, and guided by principles broader than the visible record. And now, with the groundwork laid, we move from the structure of their society to the material evidence that challenges conventional explanations even more forcefully. The next chapter leads us into the archaeological body itself, the inscriptions, ruins, and artifacts that reveal not only how the Sumerians lived, but what they may have carried from a forgotten age, lingering beneath their foundations. The physical remnants of early Mesopotamia now draw us deeper into the enigma, for the stones, tablets, and fragments that survived across millennia speak in a language older than written words. Archaeology here is not merely the uncovering of walls and pottery, it is the recovery of intention. Each layer reveals decisions made with a precision that seems out of alignment with the expected developmental arc of early civilizations. When explorers brushed away the soil at Eridu, they found temple beneath temple, 17 layers stacked like echoes, each rebuilding an older memory. At Uruk, the foundations of ceremonial complexes hinted at architectural mathematics not yet credited to humankind at the time. And in Nimrud, carefully carved bas-reliefs glimmered with depictions of tools and gestures whose meanings remain clouded, as though they illustrated rituals or technologies no longer understood. These fragments form an archaeological body whose coherence challenges the linear script of progress, inviting us to see the remnants not just as ruins, but as records of something larger. One of the most striking aspects of these discoveries is how the inscriptions themselves serve as dual witnesses. On one hand, they preserve administrative facts, quantities of grain, labor rotations, offerings to temples. On the other, they preserve mythic and symbolic stories that gesture toward origins and inheritances. When pieces of the Epic of Gilgamesh were uncovered in the library of Ashurbanipal, scholars realized they were not encountering a singular narrative, but a compilation of tales drawn from far older Sumerian traditions. These stories speak of kings who reigned before the flood, of cities rebuilt after catastrophes, of knowledge salvaged from eras erased by time. While such accounts occupy the realm of myth, the archaeological layers beneath them reveal flood deposits, burned strata, abandoned quarters, physical correlates to the cycles described in the tablets. Archaeology and mythology, often treated as separate threads, here begin to braid into a single rope. Among the artifacts uncovered are carved cylinder seals, tiny but intricate tools that compress entire world views into rotating images. Mythic figures, celestial beings, ritual scenes, and complex geometric motifs adorn them. To modern eyes, they appear decorative, yet they served as signatures, identifiers, and conveyors of symbolic meaning. Some depict constellations with surprising accuracy. Others include motifs that resemble mechanical forms. Though interpretations vary, their presence underscores a society deeply invested in merging cosmic understanding with earthly order. These seals, found in great numbers, represent not ornamental whimsy, but an encoded worldview. They are microcosms of a civilization that saw itself woven into a much older tapestry. Architectural fragments deepen this tension between what should exist and what does. The precision of ziggurat construction, the alignment of sacred spaces, and the distribution of public courtyards all point to a system of measurement with stable standards. Archaeologists note that the earliest bricks follow consistent dimensions across vast areas, implying centralized planning or widespread shared knowledge. Even more curious are the stone foundations with drill holes and grooves whose function remains ambiguous. Some appear too symmetrical to be incidental. Others resemble alignment markers or fixtures for devices long since vanished. Though interpretations remain tentative, the consistency of these features across sites suggests a tradition rooted in knowledge not fully captured by the written record. The inscriptions discovered in temple storerooms add further intrigue. Some describe offerings and rituals, yet others list materials and constructions using terminology that does not neatly translate. Words for tools, substances, or procedures appear without clear equivalents, hinting at processes now lost to time. Scholars often translate these terms as symbolic expressions, but the possibility remains that they once referred to technical practices that survived only as fragments by the time they were committed to clay. The presence of precision artifacts, lenses, drilled vessels, electrical jars, aligns with this possibility, suggesting that ancient scribes documented procedures whose original purposes had faded into ritual by the time they reached the tablets we now study. As the camera closes in on broken stone and cracked clay, it becomes clear that archaeology alone cannot answer every question raised by these objects. Yet the evidence does not sit in isolation. The precision of the artifacts mirrors the sophistication of the architecture. The symbolic inscriptions echo the mythic claims of inherited knowledge. Something binds these elements together. Perhaps it is continuity through forgotten epochs, or perhaps it is the resilience of knowledge passed through collapse. Whatever the cause, the archaeological body refuses to conform neatly to conventional expectations. This block draws to a quiet, steady conclusion as the fragments coalesce into a mosaic that feels both familiar and elusive. The ruins provide structure, the inscriptions provide voice, and the artifacts provide challenge. Together, they hint at a civilization emerging not from gradual evolution, but from memory. And as we step forward, we turn to the administrative evidence, lists, seals, and records that reveal the inner mechanics of how this remembered world functioned, preserved and perhaps concealed the deeper truths behind its remarkable beginnings. The deeper we move into the administrative core of ancient Mesopotamia, the clearer it becomes that the Sumerians were not merely building cities, they were constructing systems, vast frameworks of order that reveal a civilization operating with a sophistication far out of proportion to its antiquity. While ruins and artifacts offer silent testimony, the administrative records speak with startling clarity. In storerooms beneath temples and in archives stacked within palace walls, scribes left behind tens of thousands of clay tablets, each one a fragment of a world defined by structure. These tablets detail transactions, inventories, census counts, labor assignments, and resource distributions with a precision that resembles modern bureaucratic systems far more than the expected simplicity of early urban life. They function almost like a coded language of logistics, proving that the Sumerians were not only recording their world, they were managing it. One of the most revealing elements of this administrative body is the use of seals. Cylinder seals, carved with astonishing intricacy, served as signatures and authorizations. To roll one across a fresh tablet was to assert identity, authority, and accountability. The patterns on these seals are not merely decorative. They represent a merging of personal identity with cosmic symbolism, an indication that order on earth reflected order in heaven. Some seals display star patterns and geometric alignments that suggest an understanding of celestial movements. Others depict scenes of officials interacting with deities, blending governance with divinity as though the two were inseparable. These seals reveal a society where administration was not an afterthought. It was an ideology. The lists preserved on tablets are equally compelling. Systems of measurement were standardized early, with units governing grain, labor time, land area, and even the sizes of storage jars. Ratios appear consistently across sites, implying that widespread standardization existed long before the first known empires consolidated power. Some lists read almost like instruction manuals: materials, quantities, procedures. Others document tools whose purposes remain unclear, with terms that evade translation. These lists hint at technical practices that may have survived long after their origins were forgotten. Such remnants offer a tantalizing connection to the impossible artifacts. lenses, precision-drilled vessels, strange copper-iron assemblies, objects that suggest practical knowledge we have yet to fully decode. The presence of scribal schools further strengthens the impression of an inherited administrative system. Students trained for years, memorizing symbols and numeric systems, learning to calculate field areas, and mastering the interplay between economic record and ritual observance. Their training was not casual. It was structured, regimented, and extensive. The existence of such schools so early in history suggests that literacy and numeracy were already foundational, not experimental. The educational tablets uncovered in these schools often include geometric problems, square root approximations, and astronomical notes, topics far beyond what one expects from the dawn of writing. This scholastic discipline implies that a robust intellectual tradition preceded the visible historical record. Another striking aspect of the administrative evidence is its consistency across centuries. Even as dynasties rose and fell, the structure of record-keeping remained remarkably stable. Tablets from different cities, separated by hundreds of years, use similar formats and ratios. This continuity begs the question, how did such a sophisticated system appear so early and remain so uniform across time? It is difficult to reconcile this stability with the assumption of a civilization slowly learning to organize itself. Instead, it resembles the maintenance of an inherited knowledge system, one preserved because it already worked, not because it emerged from trial and error. In several temples, inscriptions describe inventories of materials used for rituals or construction. These lists include metals, oils, stones, fabrics, and substances whose identities remain debated. Some appear alchemical in nature, others technical. Even more curious are the references to objects crafted according to the ancient pattern, a phrase that appears in multiple contexts. Such wording raises the possibility that certain designs or procedures were believed to originate from a time before the current age, preserved as tradition rather than innovation. In this sense, the administrative tablets become custodial texts, guardians of knowledge carried through disruption. As this block draws to its conclusion, the administrative machinery of Sumer reveals itself not as an early experiment, but as a fully developed system from the moment it enters the historical stage. The seals, the lists, the educational frameworks, the ratios, the standardized measures, all of these elements reflect a maturity difficult to reconcile with a civilization supposedly in its first bloom. And yet, this is the foundation upon which their world operated, suggesting that the true origins of their knowledge may lie beneath the layers we have uncovered. With these insights, we now turn to a more intimate dimension of the story, the human side, where rulers, workers, and scribes embody the strengths and contradictions of a civilization built on memory as much as innovation. The administrative tablets have shown us the machinery of early civilization, but machinery alone does not animate a world. To understand Sumer, to truly sense its pulse, we must step inside the lives of those who shaped it. The rulers who carried titles older than the cities they governed, the scribes whose hands pressed knowledge into clay, and the artisans whose skills hint at memories deeper than their own experience. Through them, the civilization becomes more than structures and systems. It becomes human. And within that humanity, we find a paradox as compelling as any artifact. A society that lived with extraordinary precision, yet spoke of itself as the heir to something lost. In this tension between pride and inheritance, we glimpse the psyche of a people whose achievements continue to challenge our assumptions about the world's first cities. In the courts of early kings, authority was never framed as invention. The Sumerian ruler presented himself not as a creator of order, but as its restorer. Titles recorded in royal inscriptions, shepherd, steward, guardian, suggest that kingship itself was considered a trust passed down from an earlier age. Some rulers traced their lineage to mythical predecessors who reigned before the flood, embedding themselves within a continuum that spanned both history and legend. Such claims might be dismissed as political theater were it not for the archaeological layers that reveal real, catastrophic disruptions. Flood deposits, sudden abandonments, reconstructions rising from devastation. The kings were not merely inventing stories. They were situating themselves within a memory of collapse and renewal that the land itself preserved. Within palace walls, scribes served as the living archive of this continuity. Their training was arduous, yet the tablets they produced show not only administrative competence, but emotional depth. Letters between officials carry tones of urgency, apology, pride, and fear, testimonies to the pressures of managing a world both fragile and monumental. In mythic hymns, they inscribed devotion and reverence. In astronomical texts, they recorded observations over generations. Some scribes speak of knowledge entrusted to them, knowledge they were obligated to transmit unchanged. A few tablets even reference earlier scripts of which only fragments remain, a haunting hint that the scribes believed themselves to be reconstructing a tradition already partially lost. The artisans add yet another dimension to this human portrait. Their works, metal goods, textiles, vessels, tools, show consistent mastery, yet their signatures appear nowhere. They operate in anonymity, guided by techniques that feel older than their own lifetimes. Consider the stone carver shaping a diorite bowl, tracing spiral grooves with confidence and control. Did he understand the origin of his own method, or was he continuing a process taught to him without explanation, its deeper context forgotten generations earlier? The same question applies to the maker of crystal lenses or the craftsman who assembled a copper cylinder around an iron rod. Were these innovators, or were they replicators of a pattern that once had clear purpose? Their silence leaves the answer suspended. Daily life in the cities reveals a society shaped by cooperation and complexity. Workers labored on canals whose gradients had to be mathematically perfect. Farmers aligned fields according to boundaries established long before their births. Traders carried standardized weights across distances, trusting systems older than their own families. In every direction, the habits of life reflect an inherited structure, a world in which people acted with an assurance that the frameworks around them were not merely functional, but correct. This collective confidence allowed cities to flourish, yet it also suggests that the Sumerians lived with a sense of continuity that overshadowed any personal claim to invention. Even their emotional expressions echo this blend of certainty and vulnerability. Laments carved into tablets describe fear of cosmic disorder, anxiety that the balance between heaven and earth might falter. Their hymns praise the gods for reestablishing order after periods of chaos. Such themes are not random. They mirror a worldview in which civilization is always recovering from earlier collapse, always striving to maintain a fragile alignment inherited from a time few remembered clearly. In this psychological landscape, the impossible artifacts take on new meaning. They are not anomalies but symbols, physical reminders of a knowledge that once existed openly but later fractured into pieces embedded in daily life. What emerges from this human exploration is a portrait of a people living inside two histories at once. On the surface, they are innovators building the world's first great cities. Beneath that surface, they are stewards of a memory older than their own age, a memory preserved imperfectly through myth, practice, and craft. Whether this memory reflects literal inheritance or symbolic tradition, its influence is unmistakable. It shapes how the Sumerians saw themselves, how they constructed their world, and how they explained their place in an order they believed preceded them. As this block draws to a close, we feel the weight of that dual identity settling across the ancient landscape. The Sumerians lived with a confidence grounded in systems they inherited, yet with an unease born from knowing that much of the original knowledge had slipped beyond reach. This tension sets the stage for what comes next. the turning point where their world faces crisis, trauma, and rupture. And in that rupture, the true fragility and resilience of this extraordinary civilization comes sharply into view. The dual identity of the Sumerians, innovators on the surface, inheritors beneath, now leads us into the moment where their world fractures. Every civilization reaches a point where its confidence falters, where the structures that once felt eternal reveal their vulnerability. For Sumer, this turning point arrived not with a single catastrophe, but with a mounting sequence of crises that exposed the fragility beneath their precision. The administrative tablets begin to shift in tone, from confident records of abundance to anxious accounts of shortages, disputes, and pleas for intervention. Rulers who once declared themselves restorers of ancient order now invoked divine protection more urgently, as though the balance they guarded had begun to slip. In these subtle changes, we feel the tremor before the collapse, the tension of a society aware that the world it maintains is more delicate than it appears. Environmental stresses deepened the strain. Archaeological layers reveal evidence of shifting river courses, prolonged droughts, and periods of flooding that damaged fields and settlements. Irrigation canals, once perfectly calibrated, began to silt, rupture, or fail. Cities dependent on a delicate hydrological balance found themselves confronting a landscape that no longer obeyed their measurements. Tablets speak of disputes over water rights, of fields left fallow, of workers conscripted to repair damaged levees. These were not isolated inconveniences, but symptoms of a world in which even the most carefully maintained systems could not withstand nature's persistent reshaping. For a civilization whose identity was rooted in restoring order, the inability to control the rivers must have felt like the unraveling of the very foundation on which they stood. Political tensions layered themselves atop environmental pressures. City-states that once cooperated through trade and religious alliances turned increasingly toward rivalry. Royal inscriptions grow more boastful, more defensive, as rulers attempt to assert authority in times of instability. Some kings claimed divine favor not as a continuation of ancient tradition, but as a justification for actions driven by desperation, raids, fortifications, forced labor. The tone shifts from stewardship to survival. In these texts, we sense the moral crisis emerging, leaders wrestling with the weight of a legacy they feared they could no longer uphold. Their decisions, recorded in careful cuneiform, reveal a world sliding toward fragmentation. Among the most poignant tablets of this era are the laments, poetic inscriptions mourning the destruction of temples, the abandonment of cities, the loss of certainty. They describe flames rising from sanctuaries, fields scorched or drowned, families fleeing walls that once felt invincible. Though stylized, these laments correspond to archaeological strata, showing widespread destruction and rebuilding. They capture the psychological rupture that environmental data alone cannot express. The grief of a people watching the collapse of a world they believed was aligned with divine order. In these texts, the Sumerians are no longer confident stewards of inherited knowledge. They are survivors attempting to understand why the heavens have withdrawn their favor. The emotional weight intensifies when we consider how these crises affected the scribes and artisans who sustained the intellectual identity of the civilization. Schools that once trained generations of record keepers began to contract. Standardized writing styles fragmented. Tablet production in some regions dropped sharply, leaving gaps in the administrative corpus. This decline reflects more than economic stress. It marks the erosion of the cultural memory that had preserved Sumer's inherited systems. The same artisans who once shaped vessels and crafted intricate seals now faced diminished resources, unstable patronage, and a world where the old patterns no longer held. Techniques that had endured for centuries may have faded in this period, leaving later generations with only partial recollections. Through this gathering storm, a deeper moral and existential crisis emerges. The Sumerians believed their civilization represented the restoration of an ancient blueprint. If their world was failing, what did that imply about the blueprint itself? Had they misunderstood it, lost too much of it? Or was the collapse cyclical, part of a pattern older than recorded history? Such questions linger between the lines of their laments and prayers, hinting at a society grappling not only with practical hardship, but with the unsettling fear that they had come to the end of knowledge they once believed eternal. As this block draws to its close, we stand at the threshold of a world in turmoil. The systems that once defined Sumer, administrative order, environmental control, inherited wisdom, now tremble under pressures they cannot withstand. This is the moment when the narrative shifts, when survival forces transformation, when the past no longer guarantees the future. And it is from this crucible of crisis that the next stage of the story emerges. The journey outward, beyond the boundaries of the known world, in search of answers and remnants of the knowledge slipping beyond reach. The collapse that shadowed Sumer did not end the story. It propelled it outward. When systems fractured and familiar patterns failed, the Sumerians, along with the cultures that inherited their intellectual legacy, began to look beyond the boundaries of their once stable world. This is the moment when the narrative shifts from the internal mechanics of civilization to the vast expanse that surrounded it, a landscape filled with unknown rivers, distant mountains, and half-remembered whispers of places where ancient knowledge might have survived intact. In this turning outward, we witness the birth of the epic quest, not as heroic myth, but as a practical necessity. The journey became the only path forward for those who sensed that the solutions to their crisis lay beyond the cities they had long believed to be the center of all order. The earliest hints of these expeditions come from fragmentary tablets that record shipments of unfamiliar materials, references to distant settlements, and encounters with strangers described in tones both wary and reverent. Some texts speak of lands where the old stars shine differently, a phrase that may hold more poetic weight than literal meaning, yet it suggests journeys into territories uncharted by earlier generations. Traders, scribes, and emissaries traveled routes that stretched far beyond the alluvial plains. They crossed into the Zagros Mountains, followed caravan paths into Anatolia, and navigated the shifting Gulf waters toward coasts now submerged. Each journey served two purposes: to obtain resources, timber, metals, stone, and to seek knowledge that might restore balance to their failing world. Archaeological evidence supports this widening horizon. Exotic materials begin to appear in Sumerian cities in increasing volume during periods of stress. Lapis from Afghanistan, tin from the Caucasus, cedar from Lebanon, and gold from regions farther south. These materials did not drift into the cities by accident. They arrived through deliberate expeditions requiring coordination, diplomacy, and risk. What drove such efforts? The need to sustain industries, yes, but also the pursuit of answers. Some objects found in temple caches, unusual stones, fragments of unfamiliar tools, tablets inscribed in foreign scripts, suggest an exploratory curiosity that went far beyond economic necessity. The Sumerians were reaching outward not only to survive, but to rediscover what they believed had once been known. Along these routes emerged figures who would later be mythologized as heroes, sages, or wanderers. They appear in stories as seekers of wisdom, crossing dangerous lands in pursuit of truths guarded by distant peoples or hidden in forgotten ruins. While myth embellishes their deeds, there is reason to believe that these narratives preserve memories of real journeys. The figure of Utu Abzu, referenced in a fragmentary hymn, is described as traveling to the places where the rivers begin, where the stones remember. Another tale tells of a scribe who journeyed west to a land of broken towers in hopes of recovering lost methods of measuring the heavens. These stories blur the line between history and symbolism, yet they reflect a genuine impulse, the belief that somewhere beyond the horizon lay remnants of a once unified knowledge system fractured by catastrophe. As expeditions pushed outward, contact with other cultures intensified. Traders returned with accounts of far-off peoples who possessed their own traditions of a flood, their own stories of an age when knowledge was greater than it is now. These encounters expanded the Sumerians' understanding of their place in a wider world. They began to see themselves not as isolated custodians of ancient wisdom, but as part of a network of civilizations, each holding fragments of a much older mosaic. This realization would shape later myths, merging Sumerian narratives with the traditions of neighboring cultures and sowing the seeds for legends that endured long after the original journeys were forgotten. But these quests were not solely outward. Some journeys turned inward, into deserts, marshes, and remote ruins where earlier settlements had vanished beneath flood layers or sand. Excavations of abandoned sites occasionally unearthed artifacts older than the cities themselves, objects whose style and function did not match known Sumerian traditions. To the explorers, these discoveries must have felt like glimpses into epochs lost beyond memory. And in this search for origins, we sense a powerful undercurrent, a realization that the knowledge they sought to restore might lie buried beneath their own foundations, scattered across landscapes altered by cycles of destruction. The emotional dimension of these quests is perhaps the most striking. The tablets reveal a tone of yearning, an acknowledgement that something vital had slipped away, something that once allowed civilized life to flourish with greater certainty. One traveler writes of seeking the paths the ancestors walked when the world was still whole. Another describes a mountain shrine where the old measures were said to be kept. Whether taken literally or interpreted symbolically, these lines reveal a civilization grappling with the fear that it has forgotten too much. As this block approaches its end, the narrative widens into a map of roads, rivers, and half-imagined frontiers. The Sumerians journeyed not for conquest, but for restoration. Their quest was an act of hope amid uncertainty, a search for fragments of meaning scattered across the world. This restless push beyond the familiar prepared the stage for what comes next. The encounter with those who remembered, the keepers of stories older than the cities themselves. And in the next chapter, we follow the path to a figure, or perhaps a lineage, who preserved secrets from a world that preceded recorded time. The widening journeys of Sumer's emissaries, traders, and wandering scribes eventually converge upon a recurring figure in the tablet traditions, a presence described not as a king or warrior, but as a custodian. Later scribes called him the Keeper of Secrets, though his actual name shifts across sources, appearing sometimes as a sage, sometimes as a priest, sometimes as a survivor of an age remembered only in fragments. Whether he was one individual, a lineage, or a title passed through generations, the role he played in Sumerian consciousness was unmistakable. He was the one who remembered what others had forgotten, and as the crises deepened, as knowledge slipped beyond reach, the need for such a figure grew. The Sumerians looked to him because they believed he carried traces of a world that existed before the flood, before cities rose again, before humanity rebuilt a shattered order. In the oldest tablets, he is described simply as the one who walked the old paths. Later texts add detail, though always veiled in symbolism. One fragment from the temple at Eridu speaks of a man who held the measures that were not written. Another describes a master of the deep places, a title scholars once assumed referred to literal water, but that some now interpret as a metaphor for hidden knowledge. A damaged library tablet from Nineveh tells of a figure who advised early kings in the arts the ancients practiced, a line that suggests a direct connection to traditions the Sumerians believed predated their own civilization. The consistency of these references, scattered across centuries, hints at a memory preserved through myth. Someone, or some lineage, kept alive the remnants of a forgotten scientific tradition. The stories that surround him carry an almost archaeological resonance. One tale claims he lived near the marshlands at the edge of the Gulf, in a region that the Sumerians considered ancient even in their own time. Another places him in the foothills to the east, where the stones shine when the sun is young, possibly referring to mineral-rich outcrops long associated with early metallurgy. These geographical motifs appear again and again, suggesting the keeper's domain lay in liminal spaces, edges, boundaries, forgotten ruins. Whether real or symbolic, such locations served as repositories of memory, places untouched by the layering of new cities that obscured the past. If Sumerian expeditions were seeking remnants of earlier knowledge, this figure would have been the living embodiment of that quest. One narrative, written centuries after the earliest references yet echoing their tone, describes a meeting between a king and the keeper. The king arrives seeking guidance for rebuilding a temple whose original design is unknown. The keeper responds not with new instructions, but by revealing an older foundation buried beneath the present structure. "What you seek," he says in the stylized Sumerian of the text, "was already known before the waters came." The line is simple, almost ceremonial, yet it carries immense symbolic weight. It implies that the ancestors possessed architectural or mathematical systems that were lost and later partially recovered. Archaeology supports this motif. Beneath many major temples lie earlier foundations whose alignment and construction differ subtly from later iterations, as though they belong to a tradition that slipped out of consciousness before being revived in altered form. The keeper's role also appears in contexts related to the impossible artifacts. A handful of ambiguous tablets reference stones that bend sight or vessels that hold the fire of heaven, phrasing that parallels the descriptions of crystal lenses and electrical jars. In these texts, the keeper is not portrayed as the inventor of such objects, but as the one who remembers their purpose. He instructs scribes to preserve the names of the materials, the ratios of mixtures, the shapes of tools. Yet even as he offers this guidance, the tone suggests that the original mastery is already fading. Those who record his words appear uncertain, attempting to document procedures they no longer fully understand. This sense of partial transmission aligns uncannily with the archaeological record. Artifacts whose creation implies knowledge that the surrounding society no longer demonstrates. The figure gains further complexity in the poetic laments composed after political or environmental catastrophes. In these works, the keeper serves as a symbol of memory's endurance. He wanders the ruins, carrying fragments of lost knowledge, urging survivors to rebuild according to the first pattern, a phrase that reappears often enough to suggest deep cultural significance. It is not clear whether this pattern refers to a literal set of architectural rules, a scientific framework, or a spiritual principle. But the recurrence of the motif indicates that the Sumerians believed in an underlying order predating their visible history. The keeper, in this role, becomes the guardian of continuity, bridging the epochs before and after catastrophe. Yet even as he is portrayed as a preserver, the texts hint at his limitations. Several stories lament that portions of the knowledge he carried were already corrupted or incomplete. One hymn from the city of Lagash states, "He carries the bowl, yet the measure has faded." Another says, "He keeps the names, but the shapes are dim." These lines are poetic, but they convey a powerful idea. The Sumerians perceived themselves as inheritors of broken knowledge. The keeper becomes a tragic figure, not wholly successful in preserving the past, yet essential in transmitting what little survived. His presence underscores the fragility of ancient wisdom, how easily it can be scattered across generations, how dependent civilizations are on those rare individuals who devote their lives to remembrance. In considering this figure within the broader context of the documentary, the symbolism becomes clear. The Keeper of Secrets embodies the theme that winds through the Sumerian story, that knowledge does not always advance, sometimes it declines. fragments, and must be rediscovered. He stands at the crossroads between archaeology and myth, linking the impossible artifacts to the lived experiences of ancient peoples who sensed that their world was built atop the ruins of something older. Whether he was an actual person, a succession of scribes, or a mythologized archetype, his legacy reflects the Sumerians' conviction that humanity had once possessed a more complete understanding of the world, a conviction echoed by the precision of artifacts that defy their time. As this block comes to its close, the Keeper's shadow stretches across the narrative, guiding us toward the next phase. For if he preserved memories of an age erased, then the catastrophic event that shattered that earlier world must now come into focus. The stage is set for the Great Disruption, the cosmic or earthly disaster that transformed myth into memory and reduced a once flourishing civilization to fragments carried into the future. The Keeper's presence, half historical and half mythic, now guides us toward the darkest threshold in the Sumerian narrative, the catastrophe that shattered the world before theirs, leaving behind only fragments of memory, scattered technologies, and half-forgotten patterns that later civilizations would struggle to understand. Every ancient culture remembers a great cataclysm, a boundary between ages. For Sumer, this event is recalled in flood myths, in laments for fallen cities, in ritual texts that speak of a time when the order of the cosmos lurched violently and humanity was reduced to fragile remnants. Archaeology, independent of myth, confirms layers of destruction across the Mesopotamian plain. Sudden silts, burned horizons, abandoned settlements buried beneath sterile sediments. Whether this catastrophe was singular or cyclical remains uncertain, but its effects left an unmistakable scar on the cultural memory of the region. The Sumerian flood story, known from multiple tablets yet echoed most clearly in the Epic of Atrahasis, and later in Gilgamesh, recounts a deluge that wiped away the cities of an earlier age. But what matters more than the flood itself is the way the story describes knowledge. The antediluvian kings are portrayed as rulers with lifespans so immense they seem symbolic. Yet the texts emphasize their wisdom rather than their longevity. They are said to have governed according to a divine blueprint, an order that was extinguished when the waters rose. Atrahasis, the survivor, does not merely build a vessel, he salvages the measures, the arts, the secrets of the craftsman. These metaphorical phrases align uncannily with the concept of inherited, fragmented knowledge that shapes Sumerian identity. The flood becomes more than a physical event. It is a rupture in human understanding. Archaeology strengthens the mythic frame. Leonard Woolley's excavation at Ur uncovered an 8-foot layer of sterile clay between occupational strata, evidence of a massive flood that obliterated earlier settlements. Other cities show similar but not identical deposits, suggesting that while the catastrophe was widespread, it did not strike every location with equal force. Instead, it appears as a rolling sequence of environmental shocks, a megaflood in some regions, prolonged droughts in others, shifting river systems that overwhelmed or abandoned entire cities. This pattern mirrors the mythic motif of successive worlds, a thriving age brought low by forces beyond human control, leaving survivors to rebuild atop the ruins. Yet what is most compelling in the archaeological record is the abrupt change in cultural expression after these disruptions. In the layers following flood deposits, the artifacts shift in tone and technique. Some specialized crafts vanish or simplify. Others shift stylistically as though artisans were attempting to replicate older methods without fully understanding them. Tools become more rudimentary before advancing again centuries later. This stuttering rhythm of decline and renewal suggests that the flood did more than wash away buildings. It severed the chain of transmission. Knowledge that had once been routine became esoteric. Devices once understood became mysterious. Practices once grounded in purpose became ritualized shadows of their former selves. The keeper, in this context, becomes the symbolic bridge between worlds. He is portrayed as holding fragments of the old order, guiding early kings through the uncertain aftermath of the flood. His presence hints that at least some memory survived, enough to seed the rebirth of cities, enough to preserve the outlines of cosmic order, enough to shape the first attempts at mathematics, architecture, and administration that later blossomed into Sumerian civilization. But the texts also admit that much was lost. In one hymn, a priest laments that the tablets of the before time were shattered, and that only the gods remembered their full content. In another, a scribe declares that the earliest measures were returned incomplete, implying that humanity's restored knowledge was merely a fragment of what once existed. This sense of incompleteness pervades the impossible artifacts as well. The Baghdad Battery, the crystal lens, the precision-drilled vessels. These objects may not be anomalies of the Sumerian era, but survivals of techniques that originated earlier, before the catastrophe. Their presence in later contexts could represent echoes of a technological tradition that collapsed with the flood. If so, then these artifacts are not outliers but fossils, physical remnants of an erased chapter of human history. Their sophistication does not reflect sudden innovation, but incomplete preservation. The gaps in their interpretation mirror the gaps in the textual record, the silences following the laments for lost knowledge. Environmental evidence across the region suggests that the catastrophe was not solely a flood, but a combination of geological, climatic, and hydrological upheavals that cascaded across centuries. Shifts in monsoon patterns, melting glaciers, and changes in sea level may have converged to reshape entire landscapes. The Persian Gulf rose dramatically during the period associated with early Mesopotamian settlement, submerging older coastlines and forcing populations inland. These migrations could have brought survivors from earlier cultures into contact with emerging settlements, carrying with them fragments of techniques and stories that would later crystallize into Sumerian myth. The idea that Sumer inherited knowledge from pre-flood peoples becomes less an outlandish tale and more a plausible cultural memory encoded in narrative form. The psychological impact of the catastrophe reverberated through the centuries that followed. Many Sumerian rituals were designed to stave off cosmic disorder, as though the people feared the world might rupture again without constant vigilance. Their emphasis on precision, mathematical ratios, calendrical accuracy, standardized measurements can be seen as an attempt to assert control over a universe that had once proven violently unpredictable. The urge to rebuild according to ancient patterns reflects the belief that the old world possessed a stability their own had lost. As this block approaches its close, the full magnitude of the ancient catastrophe settles around the narrative. It was not merely a flood or a collapse. It was the turning of an age, the erasure of a world whose knowledge flickers only through artifacts, myths, and the cryptic guidance of figures like the Keeper. Civilization did not begin in Sumer. It restarted there, and the fragments of the age before, the impossible remnants scattered across the archaeological record, push us toward the next revelation, that even after catastrophe, the truth remained elusive, and the path to full understanding slipped further away. The memory of the great cataclysm lingers like a shadow stretching across generations. But if the flood marked the rupture between worlds, what followed was the deeper wound, the failure to fully reclaim what had been lost. This next chapter unfolds not through sudden destruction, but through the slow, quiet collapse of understanding, a decline so subtle that even those living through it may not have recognized the magnitude of what was slipping away. It is here, in the aftermath of reconstruction, that we encounter one of the most haunting themes in the Sumerian story, the failed revelation, the unreachable truth that stands just beyond the grasp of those who sought to restore the ancient order. For all their effort, all their journeys, all their devotion to preserving fragments of earlier knowledge, the Sumerians ultimately confronted the limits of what memory and myth could recover. The myths themselves hint at this frustration. Figures like the Keeper, who once appeared as bridges to an earlier age, begin to fade from the texts. Later stories portray him not as a sage carrying intact wisdom, but as a symbol of partial understanding. In one lament from Nippur, a priest mourns that the words he kept are scattered like reeds. Another tablet describes a ritual in which scribes recite the measures that remain, a phrase implying that much has already been forgotten. These texts capture the dawning realization that what had survived the cataclysm was insufficient to restore the full complexity of the lost world. The ancient pattern remained broken, and its most essential pieces lay buried beyond recovery. This sense of incompleteness permeates the archaeological record as well. After the flood layers, certain crafts re-emerge, but in diminished form. The precision-drilled stone vessels become rarer and simpler. The optical qualities of crystal artifacts appear less refined. The techniques used to carve the most intricate cylinder seals become less consistent. It is as though artisans were attempting to replicate forms they no longer fully understood. Their work bears the unmistakable signature of imitation without mastery. Even metallurgy shifts. Alloys once crafted with remarkable consistency become more variable, as if the precise ratios had been forgotten or the knowledge of their importance had faded. Technological echoes remain, but their clarity dissolves. The same pattern appears in mathematics and astronomy. Early tablets from the Uruk and Jemdet Nasr periods reveal surprisingly advanced calculations, square roots, reciprocal tables, celestial observations. Yet centuries later, some of these techniques are used inconsistently or replaced with less sophisticated approximations. This regression confounded early scholars, but within the context of a post-cataclysmic civilization rebuilding its intellectual scaffolding, the pattern becomes understandable. The Sumerians may have inherited mathematical frameworks without preserving the underlying logic that produced them. Knowledge becomes ritualized, repeated mechanically but without comprehension. Eventually, portions fall away, leaving gaps that later scribes attempt to fill with speculation or symbolic reinterpretation. This struggle to reclaim lost understanding infuses the myths of divine distance as well. In earlier tablets, the gods are portrayed as close advisors to kings and heroes. Over time, however, they grow increasingly remote, their instructions more cryptic. Rituals that once served practical functions, timing agricultural cycles, guiding construction practices, become ceremonial and opaque. The once clear link between celestial order and earthly action blurs. By the old Babylonian period, scribes openly lament the loss of the first instructions, portraying humanity as striving to interpret shadows of a truth that once stood in full light. The cosmos itself becomes harder to read, its patterns no longer aligning with the incomplete knowledge the people try to impose upon it. The impossible artifacts now deepen the tragedy of this decline. Their presence is not merely anomalous, they are monuments to a lost understanding. When modern researchers test the Baghdad Battery and find it capable of producing electrical charge, or examine the Nimrud Lens and discover its optical precision, they are encountering not the innovative experiments of early civilizations, but the distant remnants of knowledge that once flourished before the flood. These objects hint at systems of craft, measurement, and design that no longer appear in the post-cataclysmic record. Their survival does not demonstrate continuity, but rupture. They stand isolated in time, precisely because the line of transmission was broken, leaving them as relics whose purposes growing civilizations could no longer interpret. This failure to recover the old knowledge manifests not only in tools and crafts, but in the very psychology of the civilization. The laments for lost cities reveal more than grief. They reveal desperation to restore what cannot be restored. Over and over, priests plead for the gods to return the forgotten arts, reopen the heavens, or restore the measures of the before time. These refrains echo through centuries, long after the physical effects of the cataclysm had passed. They point to an existential wound, the awareness that the world had once been more complete, more comprehensible, more aligned with cosmic order than the fractured reality now confronting them. The Sumerians rebuilt their cities with remarkable resilience, yet rebuilding their understanding proved infinitely harder. Even attempts at deliberate recovery faltered. Tablets describe efforts to gather old inscriptions, to reconstruct rituals, to preserve fading traditions. Some kings sponsored expeditions to ancient ruins in search of older knowledge, echoing the quests described in earlier blocks. But the results were fragmentary. Without the full context of the lost era, interpretations became speculative, symbolic, or distorted. The original meaning slipped further away with each generation. The keeper of secrets, once the embodiment of continuity, became a memory himself, an unattainable ideal of wisdom that no longer existed in the present. As the block draws to its close, the weight of this failed revelation presses heavily. The Sumerians stood at the edge of a vast, unreachable truth, aware that a more complete understanding lay somewhere beyond the flood's erasure, yet unable to bridge the gap. Their civilization, remarkable as it was, emerged in the shadow of a past it could never fully reclaim. And from that shadow rose the impossible artifacts, lingering reminders of a world lost twice, first in catastrophe, then in the slow forgetting that followed. This unresolved tension now propels us toward the next phase of the story, where theories and interpretations attempt to make sense of the fragments left behind and to decipher the enigmatic legacy that ancient Mesopotamia carried into the ages that followed. The failure to reclaim the ancient patterns casts a long silence over the centuries that follow, yet from that silence emerges a new kind of inquiry, one that seeks not merely to remember, but to reinterpret. As the Sumerians grappled with fragments of a world they could no longer fully understand, they began to reshape their myths, rituals, and cosmic frameworks into explanations for the remnants scattered across their lives. It is here, at the intersection of theology and forgotten science, that the pantheon itself transforms. The gods of Mesopotamia had always served as embodiments of cosmic forces, but now they take on an additional role. They become echoes of beings or archetypes that once possessed the full measure of knowledge humanity had lost. Through this reinterpretation, the pantheon becomes a map, not of divine personalities, but of the knowledge systems that predated the flood. Enki, long associated with wisdom and subterranean waters, emerges in this phase as the clearest representation of preserved knowledge. In earlier myths, he is the one who warns Atrahasis before the flood. In later traditions, he becomes the guardian of the Me, the divine decrees governing arts, crafts, sciences, and social order. These Me are described less like commandments and more like encoded instruction sets. Some list weaving, metallurgy, kingship, writing. Others mention obscure arts whose meanings vanished even in antiquity. Enki does not invent these arts, he restores them. He retrieves what was lost. In this sense, the god is not merely a mythic figure, but a symbolic reflection of the keeper and the remnants of pre-cataclysmic knowledge, divinized so that memory might endure even when comprehension had faded. Enlil undergoes a similar transformation. Originally the god of breath and storm, he becomes associated with authority, order, and the structuring of human society. Yet in some texts, his power is portrayed not as creative, but as regulatory. he enforces a pattern already established elsewhere. When he withdraws his favor, imbalance follows. Lamentations describe his absence as the unraveling of mathematical and astronomical order. The measures trembled when he turned away. Such lines imply that cosmic alignment was understood as fragile, dependent upon principles the Sumerians linked symbolically to divine presence. But the deeper implication is more subtle. They believed these principles were inherited from before the flood, and that losing touch with them meant losing touch with the fundamental architecture of the world. Inanna, complex and multifaceted, becomes the personification of transformation, boundary crossing, and restored cycles. One hymn describes her descending into the underworld to recover the 7 forgotten gifts, a phrase many interpret as symbolic of lost arts or sciences. Her myths often contain themes of rediscovery and resurrection, aligning her role with the reawakening of knowledge after catastrophe. In this sense, she becomes not merely a goddess of love or war, but a symbolic gatekeeper between worlds, an archetype reflecting humanity's attempt to retrieve what the flood erased. As these divine roles shift, we begin to see the pantheon not as a collection of supernatural beings, but as repositories of fractured knowledge systems. Their myths encode processes, agricultural cycles, astronomical observations, technological practices in narrative form. What once may have been practical instruction becomes divine drama. Where ancient engineers once built structures according to inherited principles, later generations told stories of gods establishing those principles. In this way, myth becomes a protective shell for knowledge too damaged to survive in its original form. It is a translation, a reinterpretation, a last refuge for truths that could not be fully preserved. Even the minor deities reflect this process. Nisaba, goddess of writing and grain accounting, becomes the patron of scribal schools. Her hymns describe her measuring the fields of heaven and earth, a phrase modern scholars often interpret metaphorically. Yet within the context of lost pre-flood knowledge, such imagery may represent the remnants of geometric and surveying practices once widely understood. Utu, the sun god, presides over justice and truth, but his association with regularity and cycles suggests a deeper link to timekeeping and celestial calibration. The divine takes on structural significance, a pantheon as an encoded operating system, each deity representing a domain of once coherent knowledge, now accessible only through symbol and ritual. As we reach the end of this first half of the block, the transformation becomes clear. The Sumerian pantheon is no longer merely mythological. It is an interpretive key to a world rebuilt from fragments, an attempt to preserve the architecture of a forgotten age within stories that survived long after understanding had thinned. And in the continuation of this block, we turn deeper into that reinterpretation, examining how cosmic order, celestial mechanics, and numerical systems were embedded into divine narrative, creating a bridge between the lost scientific traditions of the past and the symbolic systems that carried their echoes into the future. The reinterpretation of the pantheon continues as the Sumerians embed the remnants of their lost scientific traditions into celestial and cosmological frameworks. To them, the heavens were not a distant mystery. They were a living archive. The constellations formed a map of encoded memory, each star a marker of an order older than the cities themselves. If the gods represented fragments of forgotten knowledge, then the sky was the tablet upon which that knowledge had once been written in full. After the cataclysm, only pieces remained legible. The narratives that survived of divine councils, cosmic journeys, battles between order and chaos, operate not only as stories but as symbolic explanations for phenomena the Sumerians sensed, but no longer comprehended completely. This connection becomes most evident in how they conceptualized the movements of celestial bodies. Utu's daily crossing of the sky represented more than light and time. It symbolized regularity, predictability, and the maintenance of cosmic rhythm. His role as judge reflected a universe in which truth was tied to celestial order, and deviation from the pattern meant disorder. Similarly, Nana, the moon god, governed cycles of waxing and waning that allowed them to structure calendars and festivals with remarkable precision. The lunar month became the backbone of ritual life, a temporal anchor in a world where the deeper cosmic architecture had been fractured. The Sumerians may not have reconstructed the full pre-cataclysmic astronomical system, but what survived reveals glimpses of extraordinary sophistication. Their star lists include constellations that appear in later Greek and Babylonian traditions, suggesting long continuity of celestial knowledge. Tablets recording the movements of Venus, associated with Inanna, demonstrate careful tracking that would require generations of observation. Yet these observations are framed through divine narrative rather than scientific explanation, reflecting a worldview in which myth served as the vessel for transmitting incomplete understanding. The gods personified forces that earlier civilizations may have understood mechanistically, encoding their functions in stories that allowed the knowledge to persist, however altered. This symbolic encoding extends to mathematics as well. Enlil's role in maintaining cosmic order mirrors the function of numerical ratios and geometric relationships that formed the backbone of Sumerian city planning. The base 60 system, a mathematical inheritance so elegant that it remains embedded in modern timekeeping, appears in myths describing the measures of heaven and earth. These measures were attributed to divine decree, yet the precision with which they were applied suggests they originated from a rational system predating the flood. When scribes speak of receiving these measures from the gods, they may be reflecting the cultural memory of techniques inherited without complete comprehension. What was once practical becomes sacred. What was once explained becomes mythologized. Even the stories of cosmic conflict reflect echoes of lost knowledge. Battles between gods and primordial forces, such as Enki's struggle against the waters of chaos or Marduk's later victory over Tiamat, symbolize the taming of natural elements that earlier peoples may have manipulated through technologies or methodologies no longer preserved. If electrical knowledge once existed, if optical tools once served practical purposes, if drilling techniques once allowed artisans to shape the hardest stones with ease, their loss would naturally produce myths of divine withdrawal, of techniques handed down incompletely, of arts known fully only in the before time. The myths become reflections of absence, reminders of what humanity once possessed and then lost. The pantheon, in this light, becomes less a collection of supernatural figures and more an encoded archive of humanity's fractured inheritance. Each deity represents a domain of knowledge, astronomical, agricultural, architectural, administrative, that earlier generations may have perceived with clarity. When catastrophic rupture severed the chain of transmission, myth stepped in to preserve meaning. The gods carried the remnants of information that the people no longer understood directly. Their stories were mnemonic devices wrapped in theology, ensuring that even as mastery faded, the frameworks of understanding endured symbolically. This reinterpretation underscores a profound truth in the Sumerian worldview. They believed the universe contained a deeper order that humanity had only partially recovered. The pantheon was not simply a divine family tree, it was a memory system, a symbolic structure designed to keep the fragments of ancient knowledge alive across generations. The Sumerians did not see themselves as inventors of civilization, but as the recipients of a legacy too damaged to grasp fully. Their gods, therefore, were guardians not only of power, but of understanding, representatives of a knowledge tradition that survived only through story. As this block concludes, the reinterpretation of the pantheon stands revealed as both a bridge and a barrier. It preserved echoes of ancient truths while obscuring their original form, offering guidance yet limiting comprehension. And with this symbolic framework in place, the documentary now turns toward the heavens themselves, to the cosmic mechanics that shaped ancient calendars, alignments, and monuments. systems that may hold the final clues to the knowledge humanity once possessed before the flood swept it into myth. The reinterpretation of the pantheon as a symbolic archive of lost knowledge brings us naturally to the sky itself, the oldest canvas humanity ever studied, and the one least altered by the catastrophes that reshaped the earth. For the Sumerians, the heavens were more than a backdrop. They were a mechanism, a vast and elegant clock whose patterns hinted at a deeper structure underlying reality. If fragments of ancient knowledge survived the flood, the sky was their most persistent repository. Its cycles continued unbroken even as cities fell and memories faded. And so, in the centuries after the Great Cataclysm, Sumerian scholars, priests, and observers turned their attention upward, attempting to decode the remnants of a cosmic order older than their rebuilt world. The earliest astronomical tablets reveal a sophistication that astonishes modern scholars. Constellations are named not as collections of stars, but as components of a larger system, each tied to seasonal cycles, agricultural rhythms, and ritual calendars. The path of the sun, the wanderings of the planets, the phases of the moon, all are documented with a consistency that implies generations of observation. Yet this precision appears abruptly in the archaeological record, as though the knowledge had been revived rather than invented. The Sumerians themselves seem to acknowledge this, describing the heavens as the first writing, a phrase suggesting that the patterns above were understood long before humanity etched symbols into clay. Central to this cosmic system was the concept of cycles, repeating patterns that governed everything from river floods to royal authority. The Sumerians tracked the synodic periods of Venus, linking them to Inanna's mythic journeys. They recorded the lunar months with extraordinary accuracy, aligning festivals with celestial phases to maintain harmony between earth and sky. Even their architectural alignments reflect this awareness. Temples oriented toward solstitial sunrises, ziggurats positioned to mirror constellations, ceremonial courtyards designed to capture specific shadows at equinox. Such choices were not artistic flourishes. They were attempts to anchor the rebuilt world to the rhythms of the ancient one. But beneath this careful observation lies a deeper mystery. Why did the Sumerians treat celestial regularity as something that needed restoring? Their texts speak of a time when the heavens were misaligned, when cycles no longer matched the old patterns. Some scholars interpret these lines metaphorically, yet they take on new significance when viewed in the context of the cataclysm. If the flood or series of climatic disruptions altered the Earth's environment or reshaped coastlines, ancient observers might have perceived this as a cosmic imbalance. The effort to rebuild celestial knowledge would thus represent not simply scientific curiosity, but an existential mission. To understand the sky was to recover stability, to find within the unchanging stars the remnants of a lost order. The base 60 mathematical system, so deeply woven into Sumerian astronomy, reinforces this connection. 60 divides cleanly into multiple factors, making it ideal for tracking the complex rhythms of celestial cycles. Yet its origin remains a mystery. It does not seem to emerge from practical counting systems used by early pastoralists or farmers. Instead, it appears suddenly, fully formed, as though inherited from a culture that needed to track astronomical cycles long before the Sumerians rebuilt their cities. When scribes described the measures of heaven, they may have been recalling a mathematical tradition whose logic exceeded their own understanding, another fragment of pre-flood knowledge preserved through ritual rather than reasoning. In some temple inscriptions, celestial bodies are described as markers placed by the ancients, a line that puzzled early translators. Yet within a symbolic framework where myths encode forgotten sciences, the phrase takes on a new dimension. It suggests that constellations were viewed not merely as natural groupings of stars, but as deliberate divisions, a celestial grid designed to teach or preserve knowledge. If earlier civilizations possessed a more advanced understanding of astronomy, these divisions may have served as a mnemonic system, a cosmic template for recording cycles, ratios, and interactions. After the cataclysm, the Sumerians inherited the structure but not the meaning, interpreting celestial mechanics through metaphor because the original scientific context was gone. This idea becomes even more intriguing when we consider the presence of recurring motifs in temple art and cylinder seals, rosettes, star clusters, crescent moon symbols, and multi-pointed suns. These are not random decorations. They appear in consistent arrangements, suggesting coded references to celestial mechanics. One seal from the Akkadian period shows a figure pointing toward a star-like object while holding what appears to be a notched rod, possibly a stylized measuring tool. Another depicts a seven-pointed emblem surrounded by waves, reminiscent of Venus's 8-year cycle. The alignment between artistic symbolism and astronomical reality implies a legacy of knowledge that artisans continued to replicate long after its full meaning had become obscured. As we end this first half of Block 16, the sky hangs above ancient Mesopotamia, not as a simple expanse, but as a structured, rhythmic, information-rich domain, a cosmic mechanism that the Sumerians studied with reverence and urgency. They sensed that within those patterns lay echoes of the world before the flood, a world whose knowledge they were striving to reconstruct. And in the next half of this block, we will dive deeper into those mechanics, the alignments, cycles, and mathematical harmonies that reveal how ancient observers sought to rebuild their connection to a cosmos whose original blueprint had been shattered. The deeper one looks into the Sumerian cosmos, the more it resembles a reconstruction, an attempt not merely to observe the heavens, but to restore a framework whose original coherence was already slipping out of reach. Their celestial mechanics reveal patterns too deliberate to be the result of trial and error. Instead, they suggest a civilization reassembling a broken mirror, aligning surviving fragments of an older system into a functional, if incomplete, whole. Nowhere is this clearer than in the alignments embedded within their architecture. Major temples were not positioned arbitrarily. They were oriented toward rising or setting points of key stars, solstitial markers, and lunar extremes. Such precision indicates that Sumerian astronomer priests understood the long-term drift of celestial bodies, knowledge that requires centuries of accumulated observation. Yet this mastery appears too early, too sudden, to be easily explained by post-cataclysmic experience alone. Take the ziggurats, the monumental stair-stepped structures that dominated the Mesopotamian skyline. Though often described as religious centers, their design reveals astronomical intention. Their corners aligned with cardinal directions, their terraces echoed celestial tiers, and their elevated platforms provided vantage points for observing key horizon markers. Some researchers note that the angles and proportions of certain ziggurats correspond to ratios used in Sumerian timekeeping and mathematics. This suggests that these structures functioned simultaneously as temples, calendars, and cosmic models. If the Sumerians were attempting to re-establish a connection to the lost order of the heavens, the ziggurats served as bridges, lifting human perception closer to the patterns inscribed in the sky. Supporting this interpretation is the presence of sophisticated numerical cycles embedded in their annual and multi-annual calendars. The Sumerians recognized the discrepancy between lunar months and solar years, developing intercalation systems to reconcile them. They tracked eclipse cycles, noting intervals that would later be formalized by Babylonian astronomers in the Saros cycle. They identified the heliacal rising of key stars that marked agricultural seasons. Each of these practices hints at a continuity of observation that began before the cities rose again. Their precision suggests the survival of older astronomical habits, carried through oral tradition or embedded in ritual long before they were written down. But what makes these cycles most intriguing is not their accuracy, but their symbolic integration. The heavens were not separate from the human world. They were its governing architecture. Kingship was legitimated through celestial sanction. Agricultural timing was framed as alignment with cosmic order, and even the construction of canals followed principles described as harmonizing earth with heaven. The Sumerians treated celestial mechanics not merely as a science, but as a reflection of the deeper truths that humanity once grasped fully. To align their world with the sky was to restore a balance broken by the cataclysm. The cosmos became both template and teacher, the last intact monument of the age before. Certain mathematical inscriptions further support the idea of inherited cosmic mechanics. Tablets such as Plimpton 322 revealed trigonometric relationships expressed in base 60 notation, predating Greek mathematics by millennia. Others contain lists of reciprocal pairs structured with a precision suggesting algorithmic reasoning. While these tablets are usually interpreted as educational exercises, their complexity implies a deeper origin. They hint that the Sumerians were not inventing these mathematical tools, but preserving methodologies already ancient in their time. If earlier civilizations had used mathematical frameworks to track celestial phenomena, such systems might have survived the flood only in fragmented forms, later reconstituted as abstract numerical tables whose original purpose had faded from memory. Across the broader ancient world, we find parallels that reinforce this idea of inherited celestial knowledge. Egyptian alignment to cardinal points and heliacal star risings, Anatolian sanctuaries oriented toward lunar extremes, Göbekli Tepe's enclosure patterns hinting at stellar references, all suggest that the attempt to anchor human structures to the heavens predates written history. These independent traditions may reflect the survival of a shared pre-cataclysmic worldview, one in which cosmic order provided the blueprint for earthly life. The Sumerians stand at the early documented crossroads of this inheritance, encoding fragments of these ancient mechanics into myths, architecture, mathematics, and ritual. And yet, despite their efforts, gaps remained. The Sumerians themselves acknowledged that the full cosmic pattern eluded them. Hymns lament that the stars no longer speak clearly, that the path of heaven has shifted, that the old measures are dim. These poetic lines reflect not superstition, but awareness of incomplete reconstruction. They sensed that the architecture of the universe, once understood in full, had become partially unreadable. They worked to restore it, but much of the original blueprint had been swept away by the flood, leaving only its outline traced faintly in the sky. As we close this block, the image of ancient observers standing atop ziggurats comes into focus. Priests, scribes, and seekers gazing at the heavens not for guidance alone, but for remembrance. They were searching for the lost order, piecing together its mechanics from surviving fragments. And now, with the cosmic dimension firmly established, the documentary turns toward the modern age, where scientists, archaeologists, and theorists grapple with the same mysteries, using new tools to interpret the echoes of knowledge that ancient civilizations preserved in myth, stone, and sky. As modern researchers turn their attention to the ruins and relics of ancient Mesopotamia, they encounter not merely the remains of a civilization, but the residue of a mystery, a puzzle constructed from artifacts, texts, alignments, and mathematical patterns that seem to belong simultaneously to the dawn of history and to an age far older than the written record. It is in this space between archaeology and speculation that alternative theories emerge, challenging the linear narrative of human development and suggesting that the Sumerians may have inherited more than myth from the world before the flood. These theories do not reject science. They arise precisely because the evidence refuses to fit neatly into conventional explanations. And so Block 17 becomes a crossroads, a moment when we examine how modern scholars, engineers, and unconventional thinkers interpret the enduring anomalies of the ancient world. One of the first modern researchers to question the established timeline was Austin Henry Layard, whose excavations at Nimrud uncovered the crystal lens that would later bear the site's name. Even in the mid-19th century, Layard noted its curvature and polish, remarking that it suggested a level of optical understanding unexpected for its age. Later analyses confirmed that the lens could magnify, functioning not as an ornament but as a tool. Yet the context around it offered no clear explanation. Museums classified it under ritual, a catch-all designation that sidesteps difficult questions. Engineers, however, saw something unmistakable, evidence of applied optics in a civilization not credited with such knowledge. This divergence between archaeological caution and technical assessment continues to shape modern discourse, prompting the question of whether the lens is a remnant of a lost scientific tradition. The Baghdad Battery triggered an even deeper wave of reinterpretation. When Wilhelm Koenig suggested in the 1930s that the clay jar, copper cylinder, and iron rod might form a galvanic cell, the claim was met with skepticism. Yet laboratory tests produced measurable voltage. When multiple jars were linked, their output increased predictably. When the apparatus was filled with acidic fluids, it could electroplate metal. These results forced scholars to confront an unsettling possibility. Either the Sumerians stumbled accidentally upon a functional electrical device, or they were preserving a technique whose original purpose had been forgotten. Neither explanation fits comfortably within the accepted progression of technological history, and so the artifact remains an enigma, scientifically functional, yet historically inexplicable. Precision-drilled stone vessels push the debate further. Engineers attempting to replicate the drilling marks on diorite and granite often struggle, even with modern tools, to achieve the same spiral continuity and surface smoothness. Copper tools, as proposed by conventional accounts, simply do not account for the observed precision. This discrepancy has prompted alternative thinkers to propose the existence of advanced drilling techniques, rotary devices, abrasive suspensions, controlled pressures that do not appear in the archaeological record. Critics argue that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Supporters counter that the vessels themselves are the evidence. Regardless of interpretation, the objects provoke the same question that echoes throughout this documentary. How did tools requiring such fine control emerge so early in human history? Astronomers and mathematicians, too, contribute to the pattern of anomalies. The base 60 system used by the Sumerians appears not as a gradual development, but as a fully functional framework capable of elegant astronomical calculations. Tablets from the Old Babylonian period preserve methods for generating Pythagorean triples long before Pythagoras lived. Star lists display constellations recognizable to modern observers, suggesting continuity far older than the written tablets that contain them. While conventional explanations point to long-term observation, alternative theorists argue that the abruptness and completeness of these systems indicate inheritance rather than invention. The knowledge appears revived, not discovered. Other anomalies extend beyond Mesopotamia, forming a global pattern that some researchers view as circumstantial evidence of a lost scientific culture predating the flood. Göbekli Tepe's enclosures exhibit alignments hinting at astronomical awareness, thousands of years before the rise of Sumer. The Indus Valley civilization employed uniform weights and measures across vast distances with a precision suggestive of a shared intellectual framework. Early Egypt produced monumental architecture that required geometric and engineering mastery comparable to or exceeding that of later classical cultures. These parallels invite reinterpretation. Perhaps ancient civilizations did not develop independently but inherited fragments of a shared older system. Such theories are often labeled speculative, yet they persist because they address the questions conventional narratives leave unanswered. Why do early civilizations appear suddenly fully formed? Why do advanced techniques surface before their supposed precursors? Why do myths across cultures describe a great flood followed by the restoration of knowledge? And why do certain artifacts, scattered across time and geography, display technological features inconsistent with the eras that produced them? As we reach the pause between halves of this block, the landscape of interpretation widens. Modern researchers, constrained by academic caution yet compelled by anomalies, offer competing views that seek to reconcile evidence with narrative. Engineers find functionality where archaeologists find symbolism. Astronomers find patterns where historians find coincidence. And the story unfolds toward the second half of Block 17, where we examine how contemporary theories, mainstream and alternative, attempt to weave these fragments into coherent explanations for the impossible legacy of the ancient world. Modern reinterpretations continue to evolve as new analytical technologies, spectroscopy, 3D scanning, microwave studies, computational astronomy, reveal details invisible to earlier generations of researchers. Each advancement sharpens the contours of the mystery rather than dissolving it. Material analyses on the Baghdad Battery show corrosion patterns consistent with acidic electrolyte use. Optical tests on the Nimrud Lens confirm focal lengths close to modern optical tools. High-resolution imaging of precision-drilled vessels reveals spiral tool marks indicating stable, high-speed rotation. None of this aligns comfortably with the assumed technological baseline of early Mesopotamia, and so modern thinkers confront an uncomfortable choice. Either the timeline of human innovation is incomplete, or ancient civilizations inherited knowledge from sources that predate the historical record. One influential modern hypothesis suggests that humanity's technological progression is not linear but cyclical. Proponents argue that advanced knowledge may have existed before the cataclysmic events described in ancient flood myths and documented in geological strata. In this model, the Sumerians were not innovators of civilization, but restorers. Their sudden bloom of mathematics, astronomy, and administration becomes a reactivation of preserved knowledge rather than spontaneous development. Evidence supporting this view includes the abrupt appearance of writing systems, the sophistication of early urban planning, and the advanced numerical frameworks that seem disconnected from any gradual buildup. Critics dismiss this as romantic speculation, yet the pattern remains. The earliest examples of Sumerian knowledge are often the most refined, and later periods show simplification rather than progression. Another school of thought examines the possibility of lost intermediary cultures, societies that existed between the end of the last ice age and the rise of Sumer but were erased by sea level rise or climatic instability. The rapid flooding of the Persian Gulf Basin, which submerged vast areas that were once habitable, provides a geographical candidate for such a lost culture. Sediment cores reveal that the coastline advanced dramatically over a relatively short period, potentially displacing populations whose material traces now lie beneath hundreds of feet of water. If these peoples possessed advanced techniques, optics, drilling methods, electrochemical knowledge, their traditions could have filtered into early Mesopotamia through refugees or preserved artifacts. This theory aligns with Sumerian myths that describe sages emerging from the sea, bringing knowledge from lands no longer visible. A more symbolic yet psychologically compelling interpretation suggests that the impossible artifacts represent not remnants of a lost high-tech civilization, but the echoes of cognitive frameworks that early humans developed and later abandoned. In this reading, the Sumerians stand at the transition between mythic cognition, where symbolic thinking blurs with technical intuition, and analytic cognition, where systems become formalized. The crystal lens becomes a metaphor for vision, the battery a metaphor for stored power, the drilled vessels a metaphor for order imposed on chaos. Yet this approach struggles against the stubborn physicality of the artifacts themselves. A functional battery is still a battery, regardless of metaphor. Interdisciplinary thinkers propose hybrid models. In these frameworks, the Sumerians inherited fragments of older knowledge systems that were themselves partly symbolic, partly technological. Over generations, these systems became ritualized. Techniques were preserved without explanation, calculations repeated without understanding, objects constructed without clarity of purpose. When viewed through this lens, the artifacts become neither evidence of extraterrestrial influence nor mere curiosities. They are the fossil record of a cognitive tradition that blended symbolic, observational, and technical knowledge into a unified worldview. The collapse of that worldview during the cataclysm fractured its components, leaving later civilizations with isolated pieces rather than a coherent whole. These reinterpretations resonate with global patterns. Ancient Egyptian myths describe a time when the gods walked among men, and knowledge was returned after a flood. The Indus Valley civilization exhibits standardization that suggests inherited frameworks. Andean cultures preserve myths of earlier ages destroyed by deluge, followed by reconstruction guided by memory. Even in Australia and Polynesia, oral traditions speak of rising seas swallowing ancient lands. The recurrence of flood narratives across distant cultures suggests not a shared imagination, but a shared trauma, and possibly a shared loss of knowledge. In academic circles, caution prevails. Most scholars acknowledge the anomalies, but prefer explanations grounded in known historical processes, trade diffusion, rare individual innovations, or coincidental functional designs. Yet as more artifacts undergo technical scrutiny, the boundary between conventional and alternative interpretations becomes increasingly porous. The simplest explanation, that the Sumerians inherited fragments of a lost tradition, remains controversial, not because evidence contradicts it, but because it challenges deeply ingrained assumptions about human progress. Modern researchers thus stand where the Sumerians once stood, facing fragments of a larger truth, uncertain of the whole. The impossible artifacts demand interpretation, but each interpretation reveals only part of the picture. And as this block concludes, the narrative shifts to a new perspective, where science steps forward, not to dismiss the mysteries, but to weigh them, measure them, and determine which parts of the ancient record reflect genuine anomalies and which reflect the natural consequences of time, erosion, and collective memory. The modern world, armed with analytical tools unimaginable to the ancient scribes, now steps into the mystery with the intention not to speculate, but to measure. Science becomes the counterbalance, not to dismiss the anomalies, but to test them, weigh them, and determine what the ancient record can genuinely support. If earlier blocks explored myth, inheritance, and alternative theories, Block 18 confronts the physical evidence directly. It examines geology, material science, physics, and archaeology with the sober clarity of modern instrumentation. And yet, as the data accumulates, the mystery does not diminish. It sharpens. For every explanation grounded firmly in natural processes, another phenomenon resists reduction, holding its ground as a stubborn reminder that not all questions about humanity's earliest civilizations can yet be resolved. The geological foundation offers the first layer of clarity. Sediment cores from the Mesopotamian basin reveal unmistakable signs of massive hydrological disruption. Sudden deposits of fine clay, shifts in river courses, and layers indicating abrupt abandonment and reoccupation of settlements. These findings support the presence of significant flooding events, though not necessarily a singular global cataclysm. Instead, the geological story points to a series of intense climatic shifts occurring over centuries. Melting glacial runoff, rising sea levels, changes in monsoon patterns, all capable of overwhelming early settlements. The Persian Gulf, once a dry valley supporting human populations, filled rapidly during the early Holocene. What was once habitable became submerged, preserving beneath its waters a region whose archaeological secrets remain inaccessible. This geological backdrop lends credibility to the Sumerian flood narratives without requiring supernatural scale, offering a natural mechanism for the rupture between pre- and post-cataclysmic worlds. Archaeology adds another measured voice. Excavated cities such as Ur, Uruk, and Eridu reveal clear stratigraphic divisions between pre-flood and post-flood layers. Tools, pottery styles, and construction techniques shift markedly across these boundaries. While conventional interpretations see this as evidence of gradual evolution, the suddenness with which some techniques appear or disappear complicates that narrative. For instance, the precision evident in early stone vessels is not maintained consistently over time. Similarly, the sophistication of early mathematical tablets appears abruptly, then fluctuates. Archaeologists explain these patterns through cultural diffusion, resource availability, or shifts in political power. These explanations hold weight, yet they do not fully resolve the abruptness of certain transitions. Even within the scientific community, the debate continues. Do these changes represent innovation, or are they attempts to reconstruct practices whose original logic had been lost? Material science brings the conversation into sharper focus. Analyses of the Baghdad Battery components reveal corrosion patterns consistent with the presence of acidic electrolytes. Copper cylinders contain residues suggesting contact with substances like vinegar or grape juice, fluids capable of powering a galvanic cell. Critics argue that these jars may have held scrolls, medicines, or sacred oils instead. Supporters point out that the combination of materials is functionally identical to an early battery and that electroplating experiments using replicas have produced convincing results. Material science cannot confirm intention, but it does confirm capability. The device works. Whether deliberately engineered or accidentally assembled, the artifact challenges assumptions about the technological limitations of its time. Optical tests on the Nimrud Lens yield similarly intriguing results. When examined under modern equipment, the lens demonstrates a focal length suitable for magnification. Microscopic analysis reveals grinding patterns consistent with intentional shaping. Some researchers propose that it served as a magnifier for intricate craftsmanship, such as engraving seals or inlay work. Others suggest it was part of a more complex optical tradition, now lost. Critics maintain that the lens's imperfections make it unsuitable for advanced optical systems, yet its functional capacity contradicts the idea that ancient artisans lacked understanding of refraction. The lens stands at a crossroads where scientific data affirms its capability, but context cannot conclusively determine its purpose. Drilling analyses on diorite and granite vessels deepen the scientific intrigue. High magnification studies of the tool marks reveal regular spiral grooves indicating controlled, rotary motion at stable speeds. Experimental archaeology, attempting to replicate these marks with copper tools, often fails to reproduce the smoothness found on ancient vessels. The simplest explanation is that ancient craftsmen used abrasive slurries, sand or quartz combined with water, to enhance cutting efficiency. But even with abrasives, maintaining the observed concentric precision requires a level of mechanical control that simple hand tools do not easily provide. Some researchers posit the use of weighted drills, bow-driven spindles, or suspended counterweights. These explanations bridge the gap between anomaly and plausibility, but do not fully account for the most precise examples. Science can model the mechanics, yet uncertainty remains regarding how consistently and effectively such methods could have been applied. Where geology and material science offer clarity, physics introduces new questions. The electrical output of the Baghdad Battery, though modest, is reliable. If connected in series, multiple units could generate several volts. Physicists analyzing these results consider potential uses: electroplating, medicinal stimulation, or ritual demonstrations of spark or sensation. Each is theoretically plausible. Yet physics alone cannot determine whether the ancient creators intended such effects or merely produced them incidentally. The boundary between intentional engineering and accidental discovery blurs, a familiar challenge when studying ancient technologies whose cultural contexts have been lost. As Part 1 concludes, science stands as both validator and skeptic. It confirms the physical capabilities of the artifacts, the reality of the flood layers, the precision of the tools, and the astronomical accuracy of ancient observations. Yet it does not unravel the deeper mystery, how such knowledge emerged so suddenly, nor why some techniques appear in refined form before declining. And so, in Part 2, we follow science deeper into dating methods, cognitive archaeology, and interdisciplinary studies, seeking to understand how much of the ancient world can be explained through known processes and how much remains a whisper from an age beyond the reach of evidence. Scientific inquiry continues its descent into the past, peeling back layers of assumption with tools that quantify what myth and memory only gesture toward. Radiocarbon dating, thermoluminescence, and stratigraphic sequencing refine our understanding of when the great transitions occurred. Yet even these methods reveal discontinuities that resist easy integration. Some of the earliest sophisticated artifacts appear in layers older than expected. Others vanish abruptly without evidence of decline. The dating methods themselves are precise, but they cannot explain why certain technologies burst into existence fully formed. Instead, they underscore a fundamental tension. Human creativity is indisputable, but so too is the abruptness with which complexity emerges in the archaeological record. Cognitive archaeology attempts to bridge this gap by reconstructing how ancient peoples might have conceptualized their world. Through analysis of symbolism, linguistic patterns, and spatial organization, researchers propose that early Mesopotamians possessed cognitive frameworks far more advanced than once assumed. The efficiency of their administrative systems, the sophistication of their mathematics, and the consistency of their architectural alignments all suggest not merely competence, but conceptual depth. Yet even cognitive archaeology acknowledges its limits. It can model how ideas spread, but it cannot account for their origins when the earliest examples already display refinement. The Sumerians appear at the dawn of written history thinking in systems, an anomaly that remains difficult to reconcile with gradualist models of cultural evolution. Interdisciplinary research brings new tools to the table. Climate science reconstructs ancient weather patterns, revealing environmental pressures that could have shaped migration, innovation, and cultural adaptation. Genetics traces population movements across millennia, showing how groups flowed through the Near East before and after the last ice age. Computational modeling simulates the development of early social networks, illustrating how ideas might proliferate under specific conditions. These fields enrich our understanding of the forces acting upon ancient peoples, yet none fully explains the precision found in the out-of-place artifacts or the mathematical and astronomical knowledge embedded in Sumerian culture. They illuminate the stage but leave the script incomplete. Experimental archaeology offers perhaps the most grounded counterbalance to speculation. When modern artisans attempt to recreate ancient technologies using only period-accurate tools, they achieve mixed results. Some experiments successfully demonstrate how copper tools, abrasives, and controlled motion can produce surprisingly fine drilling marks. Others show that simple glass or crystal can be shaped into lenses with careful grinding. These successes remind us that ancient humans were inventive, resourceful, and capable of remarkable craftsmanship without advanced machinery. Yet even these demonstrations cannot fully replicate the most precise ancient artifacts, not with the efficiency, speed, or consistency implied by the originals. Experimentation proves possibility, but not probability. It shows what could have been done, but not what was done, nor how often, nor by whom. Scientific skepticism, however, insists on caution. Many anomalies fall within the realm of rare but plausible achievements. A single artisan's moment of brilliance can produce an exceptional object without implying a lost technological tradition. A structure aligned to the rising sun might be symbolic rather than scientific. Copper tools can, under optimal conditions, achieve results that appear impossible at first glance. Skepticism reminds us that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that coincidence or misinterpretation must be ruled out before embracing more dramatic conclusions. Yet in the case of the Sumerian anomalies, skepticism alone cannot sweep away the accumulated weight of patterns, sudden sophistication, recurring technological enigmas, and robust myths of inherited knowledge. What emerges from scientific counterbalance is a nuanced picture. The geological record validates ancient memories of catastrophe. Material science confirms the functionality of certain anomalous artifacts. Physics acknowledges the electrical potential of ancient devices. Astronomy recognizes the precision of early sky watchers. Yet none of these fields, independently or collectively, delivers a definitive explanation for the abrupt emergence of complexity in early Mesopotamia. The scientific method excels at describing mechanisms and ruling out impossibilities, but it is less equipped to reconstruct lost intellectual lineages or to recover knowledge erased by cataclysm and time. Thus, science does not close the door on mystery. It frames it. It narrows the possibilities without eliminating the profound question hovering at the heart of this documentary. Did the Sumerians build civilization from scratch, or did they inherit the remnants of an older, forgotten world? The tools of modern analysis illuminate the artifacts but cannot decode their full historical context. The evidence remains tantalizing, suggestive, incomplete, unresolved. As this block nears its close, the scientific counterbalance stands not as a refutation of ancient mystery, but as its most disciplined companion. It shows where the limits lie, where speculation must give way to observation, and where answers remain elusive. And with this foundation, the documentary now turns toward synthesis, the hypothesis of a lost civilization whose fragments shaped the world that followed, and whose echoes persist in the impossible artifacts that began our journey. The scientific counterbalance has clarified what the evidence can support, but it has also illuminated what remains unexplained, an open space in the historical record where possibility gathers. Into this space enters the hypothesis of a lost civilization, a framework not built on fantasy but on patterns that repeat across archaeology, myth, geology, and material science. This hypothesis does not claim that an advanced global society once spanned continents, nor that forgotten empires wielded machines beyond modern comprehension. Rather, it suggests something both more modest and more profound, that before the flood, before the rapid rise of known civilizations, there existed pockets of complex knowledge, small, rarefied centers of innovation or tradition, whose insights seeded the cultures that emerged after catastrophe. These fragments did not survive whole. They survived as echoes, embedded in artifacts, myths, and systems whose origins lay beyond the grasp of their inheritors. The Sumerians appear to sit at a critical juncture in this transmission. Their civilization rose quickly and with startling organization, as though built upon a template. The more we examine their earliest cities, the more their sudden cohesiveness challenges gradualist explanations. Writing appears not in primitive form, but as a functional administrative script. Mathematics emerges not as simple counting, but as a sophisticated base 60 system capable of encoding astronomical cycles. Irrigation networks reveal hydraulic engineering principles that require more than trial and error. Temple alignments mirror celestial patterns that would require centuries of observation to discern. Each of these components could theoretically have arisen independently, but the convergence of all of them at the earliest stages suggests inheritance, not continuity, but restoration. Other ancient cultures mirror this pattern of sudden complexity. Egypt's Old Kingdom architecture displays geometric mastery and monumental precision that seem disproportionate to its early context. The Indus Valley employed standardized weights, measures, and city planning at a scale that implies prior conceptual frameworks. And at Göbekli Tepe, structures older than agriculture exhibit astronomical alignments and symbolic sophistication that defy the expectations expectations of hunter-gatherer societies. These sites do not prove the existence of a unified ancient civilization, but they point to shared legacies, scattered remnants of a world reorganizing itself after profound environmental change. When seen together, they suggest that advanced knowledge did not emerge in isolation. It survived partially through cultural memory. The lost civilization hypothesis gains strength from the nature of the anomalies themselves. The impossible artifacts do not represent futuristic technologies. They represent advanced techniques achievable with human ingenuity, yet inexplicably early in the archaeological record. The Baghdad Battery is not a power source for machines. It is a device capable of electrochemical reaction, a technique that could plausibly arise in a culture familiar with metallurgy and experimentation. The Nimrud Lens is not part of a telescope, but it is an optical tool requiring deliberate knowledge of refraction. The precision-drilled vessels do not indicate industrial machinery, but they do reveal mastery of materials and mechanical motion. None of these artifacts require lost super technologies to explain. They require lost continuity. Continuity, however, is the first casualty of catastrophe, the cataclysm that reshaped the world around 10,000 to 6,000 BCE through floods, sea level rise, shifting river systems, and climate upheaval, destroyed settlements, displaced populations, and fragmented knowledge networks. In such a world, techniques could survive without context, rituals without purpose, stories without clarity. The Sumerians inherited this patchwork and wove it into their understanding of themselves. Their myths describe the ME, the decrees of civilization, not as inventions, but as restorations. Their scribes record a lineage of kings before the flood, whose knowledge was lost. Their laments mourn not only the destruction of cities, but the disappearance of the first instructions. These are not claims of supremacy. They are admissions of incompleteness. Modern science, far from dismissing these narratives, now recognizes how catastrophic events can erase knowledge. Studies of cultural memory reveal that techniques can survive as ritual long after their original purpose is forgotten. Oral traditions preserve frameworks but lose details. A lens can remain while its optical theory vanishes. A vessel can persist while the engineering that produced it becomes myth. This cognitive fragmentation aligns precisely with what the archaeological record reveals. Sophisticated objects appearing without clear precursors, techniques declining rather than advancing, and stories insisting that humanity once knew more than the present can verify. The lost civilization hypothesis does not propose a forgotten golden age. It proposes a forgotten lineage. It suggests that early humans achieved pockets of remarkable insight, shaped by necessity, environment, and long-term observation. These insights were fragile. When the world was disrupted, they scattered. Later civilizations, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, reassembled fragments without ever fully recovering the whole. Their brilliance, therefore, is both original and inherited. They innovated within the boundaries of what they remembered, restoring as much as they reinvented. As we pause before the second half of this block, the shape of the hypothesis becomes clear. It is not a story of lost wonders. It is a story of lost coherence. The fragments remain, artifacts without context, myths without explanation, techniques without lineage. The question now is not whether a lost civilization existed, but how its knowledge shaped the world that rose after the flood, and how much of that forgotten inheritance still lingers in the foundations of the human story. If the fragments of ancient knowledge survived into the early civilizations, then the true legacy of the lost world becomes visible not in its physical ruins, now buried beneath oceans, deserts, and time, but in the systems that endured. Knowledge does not always persist as objects. More often, it endures as patterns. The Sumerians carried forward 3 such patterns that hint at an inheritance older than their cities: the structuring of time, the standardization of measurement, and the embedding of memory into ritual. These systems appear not as tentative experiments, but as fully developed frameworks guiding daily life, governance, trade, and cosmology. Their maturity suggests predecessors, unknown cultures that long ago refined the principles that the Sumerians would later codify. Time was the first inheritance. The Sumerian calendar harmonized lunar and solar cycles with a sophistication indicating deep observational history. Their recognition of eclipse intervals, planetary rhythms, and seasonal variations implies continuity with earlier skywatchers, whose records did not survive. Such precision is not the hallmark of a newly urbanizing society. It is the culmination of generations of sustained observation. A forgotten culture, dispersed by flood or famine, could have preserved this temporal knowledge through oral tradition, ritual practice, or encoded myth. When the Sumerians rose, they stabilized what had remained fluid, writing the rhythms of the heavens into clay tablets that would outlast their cities. Measurement was the second inheritance. The base 60 system did not evolve gradually from simpler forms. It emerged complete, capable of handling geometry, administration, and astronomy with equal grace. Even today, it remains embedded in our division of hours, minutes, and circles, quiet testament to its enduring utility. Its elegance suggests not a sudden invention, but a rediscovery. If earlier cultures developed a mathematical system to track celestial cycles, manage complex irrigation, or structure monumental architecture, then its fragments could have passed through the upheavals that reshaped the world. The Sumerians did not create the logic of base 60. They received it, refined it, and transmitted it forward. Ritual was the third inheritance, and perhaps the most revealing. In Sumerian temples, priests reenacted ceremonies described as ancient before the cities. They invoked tools, measurements, and sequences whose original purposes had already faded into symbolic meaning. Modern anthropology shows that ritual often preserves older technologies in disguised form. A chant may encode agricultural timing. A procession may reenact astronomical alignment. A festival may reflect seasonal engineering. In this sense, Sumerian ritual is not merely spiritual performance. It is cultural memory operating beneath conscious understanding. The oldest temples of Eridu, rebuilt layer upon layer, appear as palimpsests of forgotten knowledge, foundations aligned to archaic principles, orientations preserved long after their meaning became mythic. When these systems, time, measurement, ritual, are viewed together, they reveal the shape of a lost intellectual heritage. Not a global civilization, not a vanished empire, but a network of early cultures responding to environmental shifts, developing pockets of advanced understanding, and transmitting fragments through memory rather than monuments. The flood did not erase their achievements entirely, it fractured them. The Sumerians represent the first major culture to gather these fragments into a coherent whole, becoming both the culmination and the rebirth of an older legacy. This pattern echoes across continents. The early Egyptians spoke of restoring the first time, a golden age shattered by catastrophe. The Maya wrote of previous worlds destroyed and remade. The ancient Greeks preserved the story of Atlantis, an island civilization lost to flood and fire. Aboriginal Australians recount rising seas swallowing ancient lands. Polynesian navigators preserve star maps of places now beneath the waves. These stories differ in detail, yet converge in theme. A cycle of destruction and renewal, memory and forgetting, knowledge preserved and knowledge lost. Such convergence suggests not coincidence, but shared human experience across a time when the world itself was unstable. Thus, the lost civilization hypothesis becomes not a fringe theory, but an interpretive bridge. It connects geological upheavals with mythic memory, material anomalies with cultural discontinuities, and ancient precision with modern puzzles. It allows us to understand why the earliest civilizations appear abruptly with mature systems. It explains why impossible artifacts exist at the edges of known timelines. It resolves why the Sumerians themselves insisted that their knowledge originated before their cities. Most importantly, it reframes the story of human history. Civilization does not rise in a straight line. It rises in waves. Knowledge emerges, is scattered by catastrophe, is preserved in fragments, and is rebuilt by cultures that inherit more than they understand. The Sumerians were not the beginning of the story. They were its first restoration. As this block comes to its close, the final transition begins. We step now into reflection, into the philosophical horizon of this journey. If the Sumerians inherited fragments of a forgotten world, then what does that imply about our own place in the cycle? And what deeper potential lies dormant within humanity, waiting, perhaps once again, for its moment of remembrance? The journey now draws toward its quiet horizon, where evidence, myth, and speculation converge into reflection. After tracing the impossible artifacts, the sudden rise of Sumer, the echoes of pre-flood knowledge, and the scientific analysis that both clarifies and complicates the story, we arrive at the most significant question of all. What does it mean that humanity's earliest civilizations may have been restorations rather than beginnings? What changes when we see ancient history not as a ladder climbing upward, but as a cycle, one in which knowledge is discovered, lost, scattered, and rediscovered? In this view, the Sumerians were not innovators standing at the dawn of progress, but inheritors standing amid the ruins of a forgotten world, piecing together fragments of a blueprint whose original wholeness they could only imagine. This cyclical vision of history invites a profound shift in perspective. It suggests that human potential is not tethered to a linear timeline, nor dependent solely on technological accumulation. Instead, potential may be dormant, waiting for the right conditions to surface. When the Sumerians constructed their earliest temples, aligned their cities to the heavens, and recorded laws and measurements on clay tablets, they were not merely building a civilization, they were recovering memory. Their achievements reflect both ingenuity and humility, innovation and reverence for unseen predecessors. They sensed that their knowledge was incomplete, that the ME they preserved were fragments, and that a fuller understanding had once existed. Their civilization was an act of remembrance, made manifest. Modern humanity, standing at the far end of the historical arc, faces a similar dynamic. Our world brims with information, yet our grasp on the deeper patterns of our origins remains tenuous. The impossible artifacts challenge us, not because they represent technologies beyond our reach, but because they represent knowledge without continuity, snapshots of mastery with no surviving lineage. In this sense, the Sumerians mirror us. They lived with remnants of a past they could not fully interpret. We live with remnants of a past we struggle to fit into our narratives. Their story becomes a metaphor for ours. We inherit far more than we understand, and what we understand may be only a fraction of what once was known. The philosophical implications stretch further. If civilization rises in waves, then humanity is not defined by progress alone, but by resilience, the ability to rebuild after collapse, to preserve fragments of wisdom through upheaval, and to reassemble meaning after disruption. The Sumerians succeeded not because they innovated in a vacuum, but because they honored the past, even as they stepped into the unknown. Their reverence for ancient patterns allowed them to stabilize their world. Their humility allowed them to rebuild without certainty. Their creativity allowed them to merge memory with invention. Through this synthesis, they became not only founders of civilization, but guardians of its continuity. For contemporary viewers, the message is both humbling and empowering. It suggests that humanity possesses deep reservoirs of potential. The intellectual achievements of early Mesopotamia, despite limited tools, harsh environments, and fragmented inheritance, demonstrate what human beings are capable of even under uncertain conditions. If they could rebuild mathematical systems, rediscover astronomical cycles, and restore administrative complexity from fragments, then modern civilization, with its immense computational and observational tools, holds even greater potential to understand the deeper structures of our world. Yet the Sumerian example also serves as a warning. Knowledge is fragile. It can be lost more quickly than it is gained. Civilizations can rise swiftly and vanish just as swiftly. The continuity of understanding is neither guaranteed nor permanent. In this light, the impossible artifacts become more than archaeological curiosities. They become symbols. The Baghdad Battery represents the idea that even small remnants of forgotten science can reveal vast possibilities. The Nimrud Lens reminds us that clarity of vision, literal and metaphorical, can survive across ages in unexpected forms. The precision-drilled vessels reflect the enduring human capacity to achieve mastery even when working within incomplete frameworks. Each artifact is a whisper from the past. Remember, rediscover, rebuild. As the first half of this final block settles, we stand at the threshold of final reflection. The question is no longer what the Sumerians knew, nor how they came to know it, but what their story reveals about us. And as we cross into the concluding half of this narrative, we step into that reflection, into the possibility that the greatest inheritance of the ancient world is not knowledge, but the enduring human drive to seek it. What remains at the end of this long passage through ruins, myths, measurements, and mysteries is a quiet realization. The story of ancient Mesopotamia is not merely a record of what once happened. It is a mirror held up to the present, reflecting the cycles through which humanity continuously moves. The Sumerians rose in the aftermath of catastrophe, gathering fragments of older knowledge and weaving them into the first great tapestry of recorded civilization. Their achievements suggest that the human mind does not begin at zero after each collapse. Instead, it begins with the embers of what survived, carrying forward sparks that ignite new eras. Their world shows that loss is never absolute, that memory persists even in broken form, and that humanity's defining strength lies not only in innovation, but in reconstruction. This understanding reshapes the narrative of progress. It invites us to see civilization as a breathing entity, expanding, contracting, collapsing, renewing. The impossible artifacts become constant reminders of this rhythm. They are the fingerprints of earlier waves, traces of knowledge that survived in objects when it could not survive in continuity. Their presence demands humility. We cannot assume that our own age represents the pinnacle of all that has ever been known, nor can we assume that the past was simple, primitive, or unrefined. Instead, we are reminded that technological and conceptual sophistication may emerge, fade, and reappear across cycles far longer than any written history. In this cyclical frame, the flood myths take on new meaning. They are not merely supernatural tales. They are cultural memories of real environmental upheavals that reshaped human settlement and knowledge systems. The laments for lost cities become testimonies to the fragility of even the greatest achievements. And the stories of sages, keepers, and divine intermediaries reflect the profound human experience of inheriting only fragments of a once coherent world. These themes echo in our present age, where technological abundance exists beside existential uncertainty, and where access to information does not guarantee wisdom. The Sumerians found themselves pursuing a truth they sensed, but could not fully reconstruct. We stand in a similar position. With satellites, particle accelerators, and digital archives, we peer into the deepest layers of existence, yet many of our most fundamental questions remain unanswered. Where did consciousness originate? Does history move in cycles or lines? How many times has humanity rebuilt itself from the ashes of forgotten ages? These questions echo across millennia, bridging ancient curiosity with modern inquiry. In this sense, the impossible artifacts are not signs of limits, but invitations, calling us to look deeper, question more boldly, and consider that the human timeline may be far more layered than we imagine. And yet, amid all these uncertainties, one truth stands out with clarity. Humanity endures. The same curiosity that drove ancient sky watchers to track Venus across the dawn is alive in the astronomers who search for exoplanets today. The same precision that guided artisans to carve perfect spirals into diorite is present in engineers shaping nanotechnologies. The same desire to understand the cosmos that animated Sumerian temple builders fuels our exploration of distant galaxies. The continuity is not in the specific knowledge, but in the impulse to seek it. That impulse is the true inheritance, the thread connecting every age across the rise and fall of civilizations. As the narrative draws to its final breath, we return to the beginning, to the small, silent artifacts that should not exist, the battery that still produces a charge, the lens that still magnifies, the vessels that still defy simple explanation. These objects are not outliers. They are anchors. They hold the weight of worlds forgotten, stories erased, and knowledge fractured. They remind us that the past is not a straight line, but a deep ocean whose currents continue to shape us. They encourage us to keep searching, not only for answers about ancient civilizations, but for understanding about what it means to be human in a universe where memory is fragile, potential is vast, and time is never a simple forward march. And so the final reflection settles gently. Perhaps the greatest secret buried in ancient Mesopotamia is not that a lost civilization once existed, but that humanity itself is the lost civilization, forever rebuilding, rediscovering, and rising again from the remnants of what came before. The impossible artifacts remind us that our story is older, deeper, and more resilient than we know. They whisper not of limits, but of possibility. And in that whisper, the human spirit recognizes itself, ready once again to remember, to rebuild, and to seek the truths that await beyond the next horizon.